Early July 1942. 24 merchant ships assemble in Hvalfjörður, Iceland, forming what the Royal Navy designates Convoy PQ-17. Their destination lies more than 1,500 miles away at the Soviet ports of Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. Inside their cargo holds sits material measured not in boxes but in industrial weight. Roughly 400 tanks, more than 200 aircraft, nearly 3,000 trucks, and thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and machine parts destined for the Soviet war effort. Each vessel carries its own arithmetic of survival. A Liberty ship, displacing around 14,000 tons, pushes forward through Arctic waters at barely 10 knots, engines burning fuel hour after hour, while the convoy creeps east across one of the most dangerous sea routes on Earth. The route itself fractures any illusion of safety. Arctic convoys travel within range of German aircraft operating from bases in occupied Norway, while submarines patrol beneath the freezing water. German surface ships also loom in the background, including the battleship Tirpitz, a vessel displacing over 50,000 tons and protected by armor belts thicker than 12 inches. Even rumors of such a ship leaving port could force entire convoys to scatter. Escort vessels gather around PQ-17 before departure. Destroyers, corvettes, minesweepers, and anti-aircraft ships circle the merchant formation. Their guns fire shells weighing several pounds each, designed to shatter aircraft diving from the clouds or submarines rising through the water. Radar sets rotate slowly atop masts, while sonar pulses travel through the ocean, searching for steel hulls moving beneath the convoy. Look down inside the engine room of one of those merchant ships. The machinery vibrates constantly, while pistons hammer against steel cylinders. Engineers monitor pressure gauges and fuel flow, while sweat mixes with the smell of oil. Above them, the Arctic wind cuts across the deck, where sailors watch the gray horizon for aircraft silhouettes. Convoy PQ-17 departs Iceland on June 27, 1942. The formation spreads across the sea in ordered columns, each ship maintaining distance measured in hundreds of yards. In total, the convoy includes 24 merchant vessels, supported by 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, and a larger covering force positioned farther west. The cargo traveling toward the Soviet Union represents thousands of tons of material essential to the Eastern Front. During the first days of the journey, German reconnaissance aircraft locate the convoy. Soon, the attacks begin. Bombers descend through cloud cover, carrying explosives weighing several hundred pounds. Each detonation sends water erupting beside the merchant ships. Escort vessels fire anti-aircraft shells upward in rapid bursts, while the convoy continues pushing east through cold fog and drifting ice. Inside the bridge of a cargo ship, the captain grips the railing while the vessel rolls through heavy seas. Somewhere below deck sit crates containing aircraft engines weighing hundreds of pounds each, stacked beside tanks dismantled into sections to fit within the cargo holds. Then, intelligence reports begin circulating among Allied commanders. German naval units may be preparing to intercept. Among those units stands the battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to Bismarck, carrying 8 15-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing roughly 1,760 pounds. The mere possibility of that ship entering the convoy route triggers alarm across the Royal Navy command structure. On July 4, 1942, a decision fractures the convoy's protective formation. Admiralty orders instruct the escorting warships to withdraw westward while the merchant vessels scatter individually toward Soviet ports. The intention is to avoid presenting a concentrated target for German surface forces. In practice, the decision leaves the cargo ships alone in Arctic waters. The convoy disintegrates within hours. Ships that once sailed in organized columns now move separately across a vast ocean where submarines patrol beneath the surface and aircraft circle overhead. German U-boats begin hunting. A submarine surfaces at night, torpedoes sliding from tubes carrying warheads weighing more than 600 pounds. One explosion fractures a merchant ship's hull, sending thousands of tons of cargo plunging into freezing water. Survivors scramble toward lifeboats while flames climb the wreckage. In another sector of the scattered convoy, dive bombers approach from low altitude. Their bombs drop toward ships carrying trucks and aircraft bound for Soviet forces fighting across the Eastern Front. I remember the first time I read survivor accounts from PQ-17 while studying Arctic naval operations. What struck me most was the environment itself. The Arctic Ocean offers almost no mercy. Water temperatures remain close to freezing, even in summer. A sailor thrown into that water might survive only minutes before hypothermia erodes the body's strength. Inside the hull of a damaged cargo ship, steel beams groan as seawater pours through fractured compartments. Engineers attempt emergency repairs with pumps and wooden wedges while the vessel lists dangerously to one side. Over the following days, German aircraft and submarines continue attacking the scattered ships. One by one, the vessels sink. Out of the 24 merchant ships that began the journey, only 11 eventually reach Soviet ports. The rest vanish beneath the Arctic waves, along with tanks, trucks, aircraft, and thousands of tons of war supplies. When historians calculate the numbers, the scale becomes stark. 13 ships destroyed, more than 150 sailors killed, vast quantities of equipment intended for the Soviet war effort lost beneath cold northern seas. Sometimes, when I review photographs of those Arctic convoys, I notice the ice drifting slowly around the ships as they move through gray fog. The ocean appears almost silent, yet beneath that surface, submarines glide and aircraft engines echo above the clouds. And if you are listening tonight, while the room grows quiet and the mind begins drifting toward sleep, imagine the Arctic Ocean under midnight light. Waves move slowly across cold water where dozens of ships once struggled forward carrying cargo measured in thousands of tons. This is the entire history of Convoy PQ-17, the Arctic disaster that unfolded across the frozen sea during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Road Through the Ice. The 27th of June, 1942, Hvalfjörður, Iceland. A fjord so cold and so remote that even the Icelandic fishing boats had largely stopped coming. The water that morning was the color of old pewter, flat and still in a way that deep Arctic water sometimes gets. Not peaceful exactly, but indifferent. A loading officer aboard one of the American freighters would later write that the silence of that fjord was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. 35 merchant ships sat at anchor in the gray morning, their hulls low in the water under the weight of what they carried. Cranes had been working for days. The manifests were long. When I first went through the loading records for Convoy PQ-17, what struck me immediately wasn't the sheer volume of material, though the volume is staggering. It was the specificity. These weren't vague war supplies. The cargo lists read like a military hardware catalog delivered to a desperate address. 210 Hawker Hurricane fighters, crated and disassembled. 430 tanks, a mixture of American-built M3 Stuarts and British Valentines. 3,350 vehicles of various types. And then the miscellaneous ordnance category, which included quantities of cordite explosive that would, in at least one case, determine how quickly a ship could sink. A clerk somewhere in Philadelphia had scrawled a note in the margin of one manifest. Final destination, Archangel, God willing. The handwriting was different from the rest of the typed form. Someone had added it after the document was complete. I've looked at that notation more times than I can count, and I still don't know whether it was meant as dark humor or as genuine prayer. To understand why these ships were here, you have to go back further. Back to October of 1941, and a meeting in Moscow between British and American representatives and the Soviet government. The Beaverbrook Harriman mission, as it became known, was essentially an Allied promise. We will supply you. The Soviet negotiators were not interested in the longer supply routes. The Cape of Good Hope route, running south through the Atlantic, around the bottom of Africa, and up through the Persian Gulf to Basra, covered roughly 14,500 nautical miles and required approximately 76 days in transit. The Soviet representatives, according to British records of those meetings, dismissed it. One account describes them calling it a route for camels. The Arctic route to Arkhangelsk, by comparison, covered approximately 1,900 nautical miles and took about 12 days. The difference was 64 days of transit time. And in the summer of 1942, with German armor driving toward the Caucasus oil fields and Leningrad still under siege, 64 days was not an abstraction. It was potentially the difference between the Soviet front holding and the Soviet front collapsing. The decision to establish the Arctic route was made by Winston Churchill with the support of Franklin Roosevelt, but not everyone in the British Naval Command was comfortable with it. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from his flagship in Scapa Flow, had been raising objections in writing since early 1942. In May of that year, he formally requested that the Admiralty reduce or halt Arctic convoys during the summer months. His reasoning was precise and geometric. In winter, the pack ice pushes south toward Bear Island, forcing convoy routes to within 150 to 200 nautical miles of the Norwegian coast. Dangerous, but with the protection of darkness and severe weather limiting German air operations. In summer, the ice receded northward, theoretically opening a wider corridor. But the midnight sun eliminated darkness entirely. German Blom und Voss flying boats could shadow a convoy for 24 consecutive hours. The Luftwaffe's airfields at Banak, Kirkenes, and Petsamo in northern Norway would be operating in full daylight against merchant ships that had nowhere to hide. Tovey's objection wasn't timidity, it was geometry. The Admiralty, under political pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt, rejected his recommendation in writing. They authorized PQ-17 anyway. There were three main routes for supplying the Soviet Union, and each one was a compromise between speed and danger. The Pacific route to Vladivostok was the longest, roughly the circumference of one-third of the globe, and after December of 1941 could only be used by Soviet-flagged ships, since Japanese patrols threatened anything flying another nation's colors. The Persian corridor was safer than the Arctic, but consumed 76 days. And 76 days, in the summer of 1942, was a number that looked like a sentence on paper and felt like a death warrant on a map of the Eastern Front. The Arctic route was chosen not because it was safe, it was chosen because it was fast. That distinction matters. Every subsequent decision about Convoy PQ-17 flows from the fact that it was dispatched for political and strategic reasons that overrode the operational concerns of the naval officers who would have to protect it. The convoy that assembled at Hvalfjörður in late June of 1942 was the largest yet sent to Russia via the Arctic. 23 American ships, 8 British, 2 Soviet, 2 Panamanian, 1 Dutch, plus 3 rescue ships, the Rathlin, the Zamalek, and the Zafaran, which were, in their very presence, an acknowledgement built into the convoy's architecture. You don't bring rescue ships unless you expect ships to need rescuing. There was also a fleet oiler, the RFA Aldersdale, assigned to refuel the escort destroyers at sea. And there was one other vessel worth noting, the CAM ship Empire Tide, a standard merchant vessel fitted with a catapult launch rail on her foredeck and a single Hawker Hurricane on top of it. 1 fighter plane, 1 launch. The pilot could be fired off the catapult to intercept an attacking aircraft. When he was done, when his fuel ran low, he had 2 options: find a nearby ship and ditch alongside it, hoping to be fished out of the Arctic water before hypothermia took him, or parachute into the sea. There was no landing back on the ship. There was no carrier deck. The entire air defense of a convoy of 35 ships in summer Arctic daylight for the most dangerous stretch of the route consisted of 1 airplane that could only be used once. That is not an editorial comment. That is a specification. What I find genuinely difficult to convey when working through these records is the compound nature of the risk that the convoy's planners accepted. They didn't analyze the threats together. The U-boat threat, the air threat, the surface fleet threat, each was assessed in relative isolation. The Admiralty knew about Operation Knight's Move, the German plan to use their surface fleet against the convoy. They knew about the Luftwaffe's 264 aircraft concentrated in northern Norway. They knew the U-boat wolf pack designated Eisteufel, Ice Devil, was being positioned in patrol lines across the convoy's route. But the compound probability of all three threats operating simultaneously against ships with no darkness and no adequate air cover, that calculation doesn't appear in the pre-departure assessments with the weight it deserved. Or if it does, it's in a document I haven't found. The convoy's close escort was assembled under Commander Jack Broom aboard HMS Keppel. 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft auxiliary cruisers, 2 submarines. It sounds like a substantial force until you lay it against what was waiting. Broom was known in the Royal Navy as an unusually able officer, a fine cartoonist, too, by several accounts, which is an irrelevant detail that I've always liked because it suggests a man who looked at the world with some affection. His pre-departure briefing to the assembled merchant captains was, by all accounts, brisk and almost cheerful. He made jokes. The captains laughed. Convoy Commodore John Dowding, the civilian-ranked officer responsible for the merchant ships, told his captains the voyage would be no joyride, but predicted they'd reach Arkhangelsk unscathed. The captains were, according to one participant's later account, delighted. The word delighted is doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. 35 ships. 11 would complete the voyage. The broader strategic context, in the last week of June 1942, was as grim as the war had yet produced. Rommel's Africa Corps had reached El Alamein. German armored columns were driving into southern Russia toward the oil fields. The fall of Singapore was 4 months in the past. American naval power in the Pacific was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. Allied fortunes were, in virtually every theater, at their lowest ebb. The supplies in PQ-17's holds weren't just war materiel. They were a statement of intent, that the Western Allies could sustain their Soviet partner, that the Arctic route was viable, that promises made in Moscow in October of 1941 would be kept in the Barents Sea in July of 1942. The political weight being loaded onto those 35 ships, alongside the tanks and aircraft and cordite, was enormous. It was also invisible. The merchant seamen loading those ships at Hvalfjörður didn't know about the Beaverbrook-Harriman protocols. They knew they were going to Russia. The 27th of June, late afternoon, and the convoy weighed anchor. The escort vessels were already moving into position, taking up their stations around the merchant columns. The fjord, which had held 35 ships in something approaching ordered silence, began to empty. Out through the mouth of Hvalfjörður and into the Norwegian Sea, heading northeast toward the Denmark Strait, and then east toward Bear Island, toward the Barents Sea, toward Arkhangelsk. The water was still that flat gray color. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of an Arctic summer evening that never quite goes dark. Somewhere aboard HMS Keppel, Commander Broom was probably at the bridge, watching the merchant ships form up around him, counting his charges. The convoy was moving. The German Navy already knew it was coming. Their agents had cracked the British merchant shipping code. The route, the composition, the departure date, all of it was known in Oslo and Berlin before the last anchor chain had cleared the water at Hvalfjörður. Chapter 2. The Iron Fortress of Norway. The 14th of December, 1941. Hitler's headquarters, somewhere in the East Prussian forests. The war is 6 months old on the Eastern Front, and already the original timetable is in ruins. The Fuhrer is poring over maps of Norway. Not Russia, not Africa, Norway, a country Germany has occupied for more than a year, a coastline of more than 1,000 nautical miles running from Oslo to the North Cape and beyond. In Hitler's strategic imagination, Norway has become something close to an obsession. His generals will later describe these Norway briefings as exhausting in their specificity, their circularity, their refusal to accept reassurance. He is looking at the fjords, at the coastline, at the distances. He is thinking about British warships. Hitler's concern about Norway wasn't entirely without foundation. The British had already demonstrated in the Norwegian campaign of 1940 a willingness to operate in those waters. Intelligence reports, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, described Anglo-American planning for a possible landing somewhere between Trondheim and Kirkenes. And if the Western Allies could establish a foothold in Norway, the consequences were strategic and immediate. They could supply the Soviet Union with reliable, uninterruptible access. They could threaten the German northern flank. They could interdict the Swedish iron ore shipments that were critical to German steel production. 200,000 tons of shipping moved along that Norwegian coastal route every day. Every day. Hitler understood the number. At a meeting with Grand Admiral Erik Raeder on the 22nd of January, 1942, he pronounced that Norway was the Schicksalszone des Krieges, the zone of destiny of the war. Raeder, according to the Naval Warfare Directorate's War Diary entry for that day, agreed without qualification. The phrase was underlined twice in the diary record, and someone had added in the margin, Weisung erhalten, order received. The underlining is heavier than the surrounding text. Someone pressed hard with the pen. The military buildup that followed Hitler's declaration was swift and substantial. The battleship Tirpitz, 45,000 tons, had arrived in Trondheim Fjord in January of 1942. She was joined by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper in March. The pocket battleships Lutzow and Admiral Scheer were moved to Norwegian waters, eventually concentrating at Altenfjord in the far north. The battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were initially designated for the same redeployment, but fell victim to Allied air attacks and required repairs that kept them from the northern theater. By the spring of 1942, Germany had assembled at Norwegian bases approximately 85,000 combined tons of surface warship, the most concentrated deployment of Kriegsmarine capital ships in a single theater since the beginning of the war. Raeder called it the Northern Shield. The crews of those ships, sitting in fjords for months at a time, waiting for orders that never quite came, had other names for it. Supportable ones aren't in the official record. The air component was equally formidable. General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf's Luftflotte 5 had been steadily reinforced through the early months of 1942, partly in response to the growing Allied convoy traffic, and partly because Hitler believed the air threat to his Norwegian fortress required a permanent and powerful response. By June of 1942, Luftflotte 5 could deploy 264 aircraft from its bases in northern Norway. 103 Junkers Ju-88 bombers, 42 Heinkel He-111 torpedo bombers that had been hurriedly retrained from conventional bombing, a detail that matters because their crew proficiency with aerial torpedoes was uneven. 30 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, 15 Heinkel He-115 float planes, and 74 aircraft in various reconnaissance configurations, including the Blom und Voss 138 flying boat and the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor. The long-range reconnaissance aircraft were, in some ways, the most important component of the whole system. They weren't there to sink ships. They were there to find ships and keep finding them, for hours at a time, while the strike aircraft assembled. What the German command had built in Norway was not simply a concentration of military hardware. It was an integrated surveillance and strike network. The Blom und Voss 138 had a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers and could maintain station over a convoy for up to 18 hours, transmitting position reports via coded shortwave to U-boat Wolfpack Command, to the surface fleet at Altenfjord, and to the Luftwaffe strike bases at Banach and Kirkenes. When a convoy was sighted, the flying boat became the nervous system of the entire German response, connecting submarines beneath the surface, aircraft overhead, and surface ships in the fjords into something approaching a coordinated entity. Against a convoy with no fighter cover, no radar capable of tracking the distant flying boat at altitude, and no means of disrupting the radio transmissions, this network was essentially impossible to break. The Allied convoys could hear the flying boats circling overhead. They couldn't stop them. On the 16th of June, 1942, 11 days before PQ-17 sailed from Hvalfjörður, the pocket battleships Lutzow and Admiral Scheer conducted a joint naval and air exercise in Norwegian waters. The exercise simulated an attack on a convoy matching the anticipated composition and route of PQ-17. They rehearsed it. That detail appears in the Naval War College review of the operation and in German operational planning records. The Germans practiced destroying a specific, real convoy before it had even assembled. When I cross-referenced the timing of that exercise with the departure date in the convoy's actual composition, what struck me was the precision of the German intelligence picture. They weren't training against a generic convoy. They were training against this convoy. The operational plan for attacking PQ-17 was codenamed Unternehmen Rosselsprung, Operation Knight's Move. Knight's Move in chess. The piece that can jump over other pieces, that approaches from an unexpected angle, that cannot be blocked by conventional defense. It was a two-phase operation. Phase 1 was surveillance and fixing. The U-boats and aircraft would locate, shadow, and attack the convoy from the moment it entered range. Phase 2 was the surface strike, Tirpitz, Hipper, Scheer, and Lützow, with a destroyer screen would sortie from Altenfjord, drive into the scattered or weakened convoy, and destroy what remained. The combined force, on paper, was devastatingly powerful. But here's the contradiction that was built into the plan from the beginning, the one that makes the entire operation so historically strange. Hitler's operational order for Knight's Move told the surface fleet to attack and destroy the convoy, and simultaneously forbade any action that would lead to damage to the capital ships, particularly Tirpitz. Attack, but don't take any risk. Destroy the convoy, but preserve the ships. Raeder accepted this contradictory directive without objection. Why he did so, whether from genuine agreement, political calculation, or simple exhaustion, is a question the existing records don't answer cleanly. The specific weight of that contradiction only becomes apparent when you think through the operational requirements. To guarantee the safety of Tirpitz while attacking a convoy, the surface fleet would need confirmed air superiority over the attack area, confirmed absence of Allied carrier aircraft, and reliable intelligence that no Allied submarine was in range. In the open waters of the Barents Sea, 200 nautical miles from the nearest German airfield, in the summer of 1942, none of those conditions could be reliably established. The operation was designed to win a battle that Hitler was too frightened to authorize. It was designed, in other words, around its own cancellation. Tirpitz could threaten. Tirpitz could intimidate. Tirpitz could cause Allied admirals in London to make decisions based on what she might do. But actually using her, pointing 45,000 tons of battleship steel at a convoy and pulling the trigger, required Hitler to do something he consistently, across the entire war, refused to do with his major surface units: risk them. The fuel allocation for Operation Knight's Move is a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives. German operational records note that 15,000 tons of fuel oil was specifically allocated and delivered to the Norwegian surface fleet as the enabling condition for the operation. 15,000 tons. It was one of the largest single fuel allocations made to any German naval force in the entire European theater during the war. The Kriegsmarine had been severely fuel constrained for months. One of the reasons the surface fleet sat motionless in Norwegian fjords while convoys passed to the north was simply that there wasn't enough oil to run the turbines. This allocation changed that, at least temporarily. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. 15,000 tons of precious fuel oil was consumed, by the sortie itself, by the preceding exercises, by the extended anchoring at operational readiness, in pursuit of an operation whose surface component fired 0 shots at an Allied vessel. The fuel was not wasted, exactly. The threat that it enabled was real enough to destroy a convoy without ever being used. But 0 shots is still 0 shots. The evening of the 26th of June, 1942, the day before PQ-17 sailed from Hvalfjörður. In Altenfjord, the surface fleet was at operational readiness. In the fjord at Trondheim, earlier movements of Tirpitz and Hipper had already been detected by Allied air reconnaissance. Photographs taken on the 3rd of July would show both ships absent from Trondheim, triggering exactly the kind of intelligence uncertainty that the German deployment was designed to create. The U-boat Wolfpack Eissteufel was moving into its patrol sectors. The Blom und Voss flying boats were being serviced and fueled at their base at Tromsø. Luftflotte 5's bomber crews were on readiness at Banak. The entire machinery of the Norwegian fortress was oriented toward a single point on the chart. The route PQ-17 would follow, somewhere north of Bear Island, in the first week of July. The trap was set. The ships were sailing into it. Chapter 3. 35 Ships at Hvalfjörður. June 1942. The fjord. Mid-morning, and the sun is already high, because in late June at this latitude the sun doesn't really set. It scuffs the horizon for a while around midnight and then climbs back. The light is strange in a way that visitors to Iceland consistently note, a quality of perpetual afternoon that makes time feel uncertain. On the River Afton, a British cargo vessel of 5,479 gross registered tons, Commodore John Dowding was working through his pre-departure procedures. The River Afton was his flagship in the way that a merchant ship becomes a flagship, not by design, but by assignment. His broad pendant flew from her mast. His small staff, a signalman, a naval liaison officer, an assistant, occupied a corner of the ship that had been cleared of cargo documentation to make room for charts and signal equipment. Dowding was not a naval officer. He was a merchant navy commodore, a civilian-ranked position created specifically to manage merchant convoys, to translate between the language of the admiralty and the language of the men who actually sailed the ships for a living. The convoy's composition tells you something that a simple list of 35 ships doesn't convey. 23 American vessels, 8 British, 2 Soviet tankers, 2 Panamanian-flagged ships, 1 Dutch freighter. 6 nations represented in the merchant column of a single Arctic convoy, men who didn't necessarily share a language or a naval tradition or a common understanding of what was being asked of them. The American ships were, in large part, Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels, mass-produced to a common design, crewed by merchant mariners who had enlisted or been assigned to the Naval Armed Guard, which was responsible for manning the defensive weapons fitted to the ship's deck. The armed guard detachments were small, typically 11 men, commanded by a junior naval officer, and they operated the ship's anti-aircraft guns, its anti-submarine weapons, and its radio equipment. They were sailors seconded to merchant ships. They were not merchant mariners. The distinction matters for what comes later, when the question of who was responsible for whom becomes something more than administrative. The rescue ships were the detail that I keep returning to when I think about how the convoy was assembled. 3 of them: Rathlin, Zamalek, Zafaran. Small vessels, specifically outfitted with extra medical facilities, with additional lifeboat capacity, with the speed and maneuverability to go alongside a stricken ship and take off her crew in bad weather. The decision to include 3 rescue ships in PQ-17 was not an abundance of caution. It was a statistical assessment. The losses on the previous Arctic convoy, PQ-16, in May of 1942, had been severe enough, 9 ships damaged or sunk out of 30, to make the inclusion of rescue ships not a precaution, but a planning requirement. You build rescue capacity into a convoy when you expect ships to go down. The Zamalek alone would eventually carry more than 240 survivors. She was designed for this possibility before the convoy sailed. The escort structure around the merchant column was layered in a way that sounded reassuring until you examined each layer's actual capabilities. Commander Broom's close escort group, HMS Keppel as flagship, with 5 other destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, and the 2 anti-aircraft auxiliary cruisers, HMS Palomares and HMS Poza-Rica, formed the inner ring. Beyond that, Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton's 1st Cruiser Squadron provided what the orders called distant cover. HMS London, HMS Norfolk, USS Wichita, and USS Tuscaloosa with 4 destroyers. 2 British cruisers and 2 American cruisers sailing together, the first time American warships had directly participated in running an Arctic convoy. On one of the American destroyers, USS Barents, the gunnery officer was Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr. That detail appears in several subsequent accounts of the operation, usually as a footnote. I mention it here because it illustrates the degree to which PQ-17 was understood, by both governments, as a demonstration of the Anglo-American alliance at sea. Further out still, beyond Hamilton's cruisers, Admiral Tovey's heavy covering force provided the strategic umbrella. HMS Duke of York, USS Washington, the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, 2 additional cruisers, and 14 destroyers. These were the big ships, the ones that could, in theory, fight the German surface fleet. But they were constrained. Admiralty orders placed strict limits on how far east the cruiser force could proceed, under no circumstances beyond 25 degrees east longitude unless the tactical situation demanded it, and the heavy covering force was operating at roughly 200 nautical miles from the convoy's position, a distance calculated by fuel consumption and fleet endurance, not by the geometry of the actual threat. If Tirpitz sortied, the calculation was that the heavy cover could interpose between the German fleet and the convoy. On paper. The margin for error in that calculation was not published. The single most instructive thing about Broom's pre-departure briefing to the assembled merchant captains is not what he said, but what he didn't say. He was deliberately light. He made jokes. The room laughed. Dowding told the captains it would be no joyride, but predicted unscathed passage. The captains were described as delighted. And I want to be precise here about what I think was happening in that room. Broom was not deceiving his captains. He believed, with good reason, that a convoy of this size, with this level of escort, had a genuine chance of fighting its way through. The tactical situation on the day of departure was not obviously hopeless. PQ-16, with far less cover, had lost 9 ships, but 30 ships had reached port. A 30% loss rate was catastrophic, but 30% was also 70% survival. Broom was not optimistic for nothing. He was optimistic for reasons that were coherent until the 9th of the evening on the 4th of July, when 3 signals arrived from the Admiralty in rapid succession and the reasons dissolved. The cargo that was loaded into those 35 ships deserves to be held in the mind at actual scale for a moment, because the abstract phrase war supplies doesn't carry weight the way the specific items do. 430 tanks. Each M3 Stuart light tank weighed approximately 14 tons. Each Valentine infantry tank weighed 17.5 tons. 430 tanks in a convoy means roughly 7,000 tons of armor loaded in pieces, hull sections, turret assemblies, engine components, because fully assembled tanks don't fit through standard cargo hatches. 210 Hurricanes, disassembled to wing roots and fuselage sections, crated in wooden boxes that were stacked 4 deep in hold spaces that smelled of machine oil and wood shavings. And the cordite. The SS Pan-Atlantic was carrying a quantity of cordite explosive that would, on the 6th of July, detonate so completely that the ship's forward section would cease to exist in under 30 seconds. 3,350 vehicles, 99,316 additional tons of general cargo. The total gross registered tonnage of the merchant column, not counting the escorts, not counting the rescue ships, not counting the fleet oiler, was in the region of 188,000 tons. In human terms, the cargo was approximately twice the weight of the Titanic. To me, the detail that most completely captures what was at stake, strategically, not humanly, we'll get to the human weight later, is the arithmetic of the 3 supply routes compared against the timeline of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942. The German Army Group South was driving toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The German operation that would become the Battle of Stalingrad began in earnest in late August of 1942. The supplies in PQ-17's holds were intended to arrive in Arkhangelsk in early July, be unloaded over the following weeks, and move by rail toward the front. Arkhangelsk's port cranes, according to British naval attaché reports from 1942, had a maximum lift capacity of approximately 3 tons per operation, meaning that a single tank required roughly 6 separate crane lifts to unload. Given the wartime condition of the port, the unloading of 430 tanks would have taken weeks. The Persian corridor route, which was eventually used as the primary supply path, took 76 days. The difference between routes, measured in days, maps almost exactly onto the difference between the German army reaching Stalingrad and the Soviet army having the material it needed to hold there. The convoy weighed anchor in the late afternoon of the 27th of June. The ships took up their positions in the formation, columns of merchantmen, escort vessels on the flanks and ahead, the whole geometrical arrangement of a defended convoy moving at the speed of its slowest vessel, roughly 8 to 9 knots. The fjord began to empty behind them. One ship, suffering mechanical problems just outside the harbor, turned back almost immediately. A second would sustain ice damage in the Denmark Strait and return. 2 ships gone before the convoy had properly begun. The formation contracted slightly around their absence and continued east. On the chart in Dowding's makeshift operation space aboard River Afton, the penciled line of the convoy's planned route ran northeast through the Denmark Strait, then east-northeast past Jan Mayen Island, then east past Bear Island, trying to stay north of the island to gain sea room from the Luftwaffe's airfields, then southeast toward the entrance of the White Sea in Arkhangelsk. The line on the chart was clean. Lines on charts always are. Chapter 4. The Ice Devil Wakes. The 1st of July, 1942. Somewhere in the Denmark Strait, in a sea state that the relevant meteorological records describe as moderate, with fog patches reducing visibility to less than a nautical mile in places. The convoy had been at sea for 4 days. It had been shadowed almost continuously since the previous day. U-456 had first sighted and reported PQ-17 on the 1st of July, and within hours, the contact was being tracked by multiple submarines. The crew of a Blom und Voss 138 flying boat, arriving overhead that same afternoon, began their first surveillance circuit. The pilots could see the full formation beneath them, the columns of merchant ships, the escort vessels moving on the flanks, the whole geometry of the convoy laid out against the gray-green water. They could count the ships. They could estimate their course and speed. They began transmitting position reports. The German surveillance architecture for PQ-17 was built in layers, and understanding each layer helps explain why the convoy's position was never truly unknown to German command from the 1st of July onward. At the outer perimeter, 3 U-boats had been stationed in a patrol line north of the Denmark Strait, specifically to give advance warning of the convoy's departure. A tripwire, essentially, positioned to confirm the intelligence that the cracked British merchant shipping code had already provided. Inside that, 5 more U-boats were positioned north of Jan Mayen Island, forming the leading edge of the Wolfpack Eissteufel. The flying boats provided continuous aerial coverage during daylight hours, and at this latitude in early July, daylight hours meant all hours. A Blom und Voss 138 could maintain station for up to 18 hours on a single sortie, transmitting encrypted position reports every 30 minutes via shortwave radio to U-boat command at Narvik, to the surface fleet at Altenfjord, and to Luftflotte 5's strike planning staff at Banak. The convoy could not see the flying boat clearly at altitude. It could not jam the radio transmissions. It couldn't even be entirely certain, from the sound of the engines at distance, how many aircraft were up there at any given time. What I find structurally important when looking at the German surveillance records alongside the British escort logs is the contrast between what each side knew about the other. The Germans had an essentially complete picture of the convoy: composition, course, speed, defensive dispositions, approximate ammunition load for the anti-aircraft guns based on standard ship complement calculations. They knew the cruiser covering force was present because the British cruiser London and the American cruiser Wichita were eventually sighted by German reconnaissance on the 3rd of July. They knew the heavy covering force, Tovey's battleships, was somewhere to the west because it had been briefly shadowed northeast of Iceland on the 1st of July. The British, meanwhile, knew the German forces were positioned in Norway, but couldn't establish with certainty whether the surface fleet was actually at sea or still in port. The reconnaissance flight over Trondheim on the evening of the 3rd of July showed Tirpitz and Hipper absent from their moorings. Absent, not necessarily at sea. They had moved to Altenfjord, but absent from Trondheim and at sea heading toward the convoy are very different operational situations, and the difference between them would, 48 hours later, cost 24 ships. On the 2nd of July, the convoy sighted the westbound convoy QP-17, returning from Arkhangelsk, 35 ships heading home, laden with whatever ballast the returning route provided, passing their eastbound counterparts in a brief, strange maritime crossing. The Germans watched both convoys pass each other and chose not to divide their attention. Their doctrine was clear: concentrate on the laden eastbound convoys, not the returning ships in ballast. QP-13 was not attacked. PQ-17 continued east. That same afternoon, 9 Heinkel HE-115 torpedo seaplanes were vectored toward the convoy by the shadowing aircraft and U-456. The attack achieved almost nothing. One aircraft was shot down by HMS Fury, and no merchant ship was hit. But it was logged, analyzed, and used to refine the tactical picture. The German air planners now had confirmation of the convoy's anti-aircraft density. They knew where the gaps were. On the 3rd of July, a fresh ice reconnaissance report indicated that the passage north of Bear Island had widened considerably. The Admiralty suggested the convoy should route at least 50 nautical miles north of the island. Commander Broom, the close escort commander, preferred the original more southerly route. He wanted to maintain the low visibility conditions that fog patches were providing and press east as quickly as possible. Rear Admiral Hamilton, commanding the cruiser force, eventually overruled the preference and ordered the convoy to alter course, passing 70 nautical miles north of Bear Island, later extending to 400 nautical miles from the Luftwaffe airfield at Banach. The routing compromise satisfied neither tactical requirement perfectly. The convoy was now further from the Norwegian coast, which reduced the immediate air threat marginally, but was also now threading a corridor between the ice edge to the north and the Luftwaffe's effective radius to the south. Every nautical mile of that corridor had been mapped by German reconnaissance. The flying boats had been plotting it all summer. I want to stay for a moment with the Blom und Voss 138, because it's a piece of technology that rarely gets the attention it deserves in accounts of PQ-17. It was not a glamorous aircraft. It looked ungainly, a high-wing monoplane with 3 engines and a deep, boat-shaped hull, designed for long endurance rather than speed or maneuverability. Its cruising speed was approximately 235 kilometers per hour. Its range was approximately 1,500 kilometers. Its endurance was up to 18 hours. But what made it decisive in the Arctic anti-convoy role was its FUG-10 radio equipment, which allowed real-time encrypted communication with multiple stations simultaneously. One BV-138, circling at altitude above a convoy, was connecting the German anti-convoy system into something that functioned almost like a single integrated organism. Positioning data flowing to the U-boats below the surface, course and speed data flowing to the strike aircraft arming at Banach, weather data flowing to the surface, fleet planning its sortie at Altenfjord. The British escorts could hear the engines. They couldn't touch the network. There is a specific exchange recorded in several accounts of the 3rd of July that I've always found remarkable in what it reveals about the atmosphere aboard those ships, even as the net was closing around them. A British escort destroyer sent a flashing light signal to one of the German shadowing aircraft. Would it please circulate in the other direction for a while, as the watching crew were becoming dizzy from tracking it? The German pilot signaled back, whatever it takes to please an Englishman, and adjusted his circuit direction accordingly. The exchange is recorded in Broom's subsequent account and in at least one other participant memoir. I have no means of independently verifying the specific wording, but the general exchange is attested in multiple sources. It was the 3rd of July, 1942. It was a piece of black comedy between men who were technically at war with each other. 24 hours later, men were dying in the Barents Sea. The most significant intelligence failure on the Allied side, and this is a point that doesn't receive the emphasis it deserves in most popular accounts of PQ-17, was the temporary loss of Bletchley Park's coverage of German naval Enigma traffic. The German Navy had recently changed its key settings, and as of the critical period around the 3rd and 4th of July, British codebreakers had not yet broken back into the traffic. This meant that the famous ultra-intelligence advantage, which had underpinned so much Allied naval success in the Battle of the Atlantic and elsewhere, was not available to the Admiralty at the moment when knowledge of German fleet movements was most desperately needed. Pound was not working from a picture of German intentions confirmed by intercepted signals. He was working from what photo reconnaissance showed, from submarine sighting reports, from deduction. The intelligence vacuum at the critical moment was not a failure of analysis. It was a failure of access. The German communications were running. They were simply unreadable to the people who most needed to read them. The evening of the 3rd of July, and the convoy was approximately 130 nautical miles northeast of Bear Island, pressing east through ice-free water in conditions that Broom would later describe in his report as unexpectedly good visibility. The Escort was maintaining formation discipline. The merchant ships were keeping station. The BV-138 was circling above them, its engines a constant, distant drone that by now the watchkeepers had stopped consciously registering. In Altenfjord, the German surface fleet was at operational readiness. The commanders of the Wolfpack Eisteufel were plotting the convoy's position from the latest contact reports. At Banach, the torpedo bomber crews were studying approach angles and wind calculations. And in the Admiralty's operations room in London, the intelligence staff were staring at a chart with a question mark where Tirpitz should have been, and a First Sea Lord who was trying to decide what that question mark meant. Chapter 5. July 4th. Fire on the Water. The 4th of July, 1942. Dawn in the Barents Sea. 0500 hours ship's time, and the sun was already well up. Had been since long before midnight, technically, though the light had that pale quality of very early morning, even at full brightness. The sea was, by Arctic standards, remarkably calm. A slight swell running from the northwest. Visibility was what the meteorological entries describe as phenomenal. 20 nautical miles or better in all directions. Broom would remember it specifically. The air was crisp and brand new, he wrote in his account. The visibility back to phenomenal. He described the northern horizon with a line of icebergs looking like chunky jewelry. It was, by his account, a beautiful morning. In bright sunshine, the convoy was visible for miles in every direction. That was the problem. The first loss of the day came early. Around 0800 hours, a single Heinkel HE-115 seaplane from the German Coastal Patrol Group broke through low cloud northeast of Bear Island and launched a torpedo at the American Liberty ship SS Christopher Newport. The ship was hit. The crew abandoned her. HMS Britomart was sent to investigate whether she could be salvaged. At 0520, according to the broadcast signal, Britomart reported the Christopher Newport flooded and her steering gear destroyed. The British submarine HMS P614 attempted to scuttle her, without success. Eventually, U-457 sank the derelict. The Christopher Newport's crew survived. It was the convoy's first confirmed loss since departure, and it was handled with something close to routine efficiency. The formation closed around the gap, the rescue ships confirmed survivors recovered, the convoy continued east. There was no panic. There was a gap in the column where there had been a ship, and then there wasn't a gap anymore, and the sea was the same gray-green it had been. What I find striking when I read the various accounts of the 4th of July's morning watch is the consistent emphasis on the ordinary quality of the hours before the main attack. Men had breakfast. The watch rotated. The weather was pleasant. The BV-138 was circling overhead as usual, its engines audible but no longer alarming. Hamilton's cruisers, somewhere on the horizon to the north, were maintaining their covering position. The convoy had been at sea for 8 days. The men aboard the merchant ships had established the rhythms of a long passage, watch schedules, meal times, the small domestic order of life aboard a working vessel. And then, as the day progressed, the British and American ships began exchanging signals. It was, after all, the 4th of July. The American ships broke out their largest flags. The British signaled, "Happy Birthday." The American ships signaled back. 2 nations celebrating independence together, 4 degrees south of the North Cape, in a convoy that German Air and Naval Command had been planning to destroy for the better part of 3 months. The major air assault came in the early evening, 7:30 approximately, when 25 Heinkel HE-111 torpedo bombers from Kampfgeschwader 26 arrived from the direction of Banach, led by a single Junkers Ju-88 acting as a pathfinder. The attack was coordinated, professionally executed, and largely defeated. The decisive factor in that defeat, according to multiple after-action assessments, was USS Wainwright, an American destroyer that happened to be inside the convoy formation at the time, having come alongside a tanker to refuel. Her captain drove her at full speed around the convoy's perimeter, engaging every attacking aircraft within gun range. Broom's report described it with characteristic directness. This ship lent valuable support with accurate long-range AA fire. I was most impressed by the way she sped round the convoy, worrying the circling aircraft, and it was largely due to her July 4 enthusiasm that the attack completely failed. 1 torpedo detonated harmlessly outside the convoy. 2 bombs fell between Wainwright and HMS Keppel without hitting either ship. The Germans lost 4 aircraft in the attack, but not entirely without cost. 2 ships were hit and would not survive. The American freighter SS William Hooper took a torpedo and began settling. The British freighter SS Navarino was struck by a torpedo intended for a different ship, the American vessel Bellingham, and took a second hit before she sank. The rescue ships moved immediately to recover survivors. 49 men came off Navarino, 55 off William Hooper. As Navarino went down, a Bellingham crew member heard a survivor swimming in the Arctic water shout across to the rescue boat, according to one memoir account, something to the effect of, "On to Moscow, see you in Russia." Whether those were the exact words or a compression of something longer, I cannot confirm, but the spirit of it appears in more than one subsequent account. There was a mood aboard those ships in the hours before the scatter order that doesn't get captured by casualty figures. There was something that felt, against considerable odds, like resilience. The Soviet tanker Azerbaijan was hit during the same attack. She disappeared into a cloud of smoke. The escorts reported her probably lost, and then she emerged from the smoke, still steaming, still on course, still making 9 knots, with a fire on her afterdeck that her crew were fighting with methodical determination. Azerbaijan carried, according to accounts that circulated widely afterward, a partly female crew, including a female officer in a senior deck position. The story may be embellished in some of its subsequent retellings, but the ship survived, and the crew fought the fire, and they kept going. The convoy closed around her, and they continued east together. When Broom surveyed the situation after the attack, he wrote in his private diary what would become perhaps the most important sentence in the entire PQ-17 record. "My impression on seeing the resolution displayed by the convoy and its escort was that, providing the ammunition lasted, PQ-17 could get anywhere." That sentence was written before the scatter order arrived. It was written by a man who had just watched his convoy beat off one of the Luftwaffe's best efforts. The contradictory command signals that preceded the scatter order have been analyzed extensively in subsequent histories, and what they reveal is a chain of command operating under multiple, partially incompatible authorities. Earlier in the day, the Admiralty had reversed its previous restriction and given Hamilton permission to take his cruisers east of 25 degrees east longitude. Then, at approximately 1858, they informed Hamilton to hold his position pending further instructions. Tovey, at the same time, was signaling Hamilton with his own assessment of when the cruisers should withdraw. Hamilton was simultaneously receiving instructions from the Admiralty in London and from Tovey at sea, and the two sets of instructions were not quite aligned. This is not a trivial administrative confusion. When the scatter order came, it would arrive into a command environment that was already running three separate assessments of the same tactical situation, none of them fully synchronized with the others. What I come back to again and again when working through the timeline of the 4th of July is the asymmetry between what Broome could see and what was being decided in London. From Keppel's Bridge, the tactical situation was, in Broome's own assessment, favorable. The convoy was intact. The escort was at strength. The attacks had been repelled with loss. The merchant crews were, his word, resolute. The ammunition supply was holding. The convoy was making easting. From the Admiralty's operations room, the picture was different. A map showing Tirpitz absent from Trondheim, U-boat contacts to the north and east, and no confirmed intelligence from Bletchley Park about German fleet movements. The intelligence picture in London was not the tactical reality in the Barents Sea. And what happened in the next 90 minutes? What happened between the evening attack's repulsion and 2136 was that the London picture overrode the Arctic reality from 2,000 kilometers away by signal. At 2111, the first signal arrived aboard Hamilton's flagship. Cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. Hamilton and his captains read the signal and drew the obvious conclusion. If the cruisers were being pulled back at high speed, the surface threat must be imminent and severe. At 21:23, the second signal arrived. Convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports owing to threat from surface ships. And then, at 21:36, the third. Convoy is to scatter. 3 signals, 25 minutes. No new intelligence received in the Admiralty between the first and the third. In the Royal Navy's tactical doctrine, scatter and disperse are not synonyms. A disperse order maintains the convoy's general heading, with ships proceeding independently at their best speed. A scatter order implies enemy surface forces are already in visual contact, that the threat is present, not anticipated. The 33 merchant ships of PQ-17, still formed up in their convoy columns, received an order that told them, through its specific choice of word, that Tirpitz was over the horizon. She was in Altenfjord. She had not yet sailed. Chapter 6. The Room Where It Happened. London, the Admiralty Operations Room. The evening of the 4th of July, 1942. The room itself was underground, or partly underground. The wartime modifications to Whitehall's government buildings had added basement levels and reinforced floors and sandbagged windows to many of the central departments, and the Admiralty was no exception. The specific physical details of that room on that evening are not fully documented in the available records, but the signals record is exact. The Admiralty's signal log preserves the 3 messages sent between 2111 and 2136, with their origination times, their priority prefixes, and their text. Most immediate, cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. Immediate, owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. Most immediate, my 2123 of the 4th, convoy is to scatter. 3 signals. The third was addressed to the convoy directly. The word scatter had been chosen over disperse within 13 minutes of the previous signal. No new intelligence arrived at the Admiralty between the second and third transmissions. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound was 65 years old in July of 1942. He had been First Sea Lord since 1939, one of the longest continuous tenures in the position in the modern Navy. He was known in the Admiralty as a man of exceptional intellectual energy, who had, over 3 years of wartime pressure, become increasingly rigid in his decision-making, increasingly reluctant to delegate authority to officers at sea, increasingly inclined to trust his own assessment over the intelligence summaries of the men whose job it was to produce them. His colleagues noted, in the period around the summer of 1942, episodes of what was described variously as fatigue, absence, and what we might now recognize as cognitive lapses, moments when the first Sea Lord seemed to lose the thread of a briefing and needed to be guided back to the main point. Pound died in October of 1943, and the post-mortem established the presence of a brain tumor that had been growing, undetected, for an extended period. How long it had been affecting his cognition, and whether it was a factor in the events of the 4th of July, 1942, is a question the available medical records cannot definitively answer. It is also, however, a question that responsible historiography cannot simply set aside. The critical intelligence exchange in the hours before the scatter order centers on a conversation between Pound and Commander Norman Denning of the Operational Intelligence Center. Denning, whose job was to assess the German surface fleet's disposition, was, by his own subsequent account, confident that the German battleships had not yet sailed for the convoy. He believed they were in Altenfjord, at readiness, but not at sea. When Pound asked him, according to accounts that appear in several subsequent memoirs and official histories, "Can you assure me that Tirpitz is still in Altenfjord?" Denning answered that he could not give that assurance with certainty. He believed the ships were still in port. He could not guarantee it. That distinction between confident belief and guaranteed certainty is the pivot point of the entire PQ-17 disaster. A more experienced commander, or a commander operating under a more collegial decision-making culture, might have said, "If Denning believes they're in port, we proceed on that belief unless new evidence contradicts it." Instead, Pound treated the inability to guarantee as equivalent to evidence of the opposite. He treated "I can't be certain" as "they might be at sea." And from that inference, he constructed a tactical reality that didn't exist and sent 33 ships into it. What happened in the Admiralty's operations room between 1858 and 2136, the hour and a half between the final intelligence briefing and the scatter order, is not fully documented. The signal log exists. The intelligence summaries exist. Personal accounts from individuals present that evening exist in fragmentary form. What doesn't exist is a complete record of what Pound said to whom, what alternative courses of action were discussed, whether he consulted Tovey by signal before acting, whether he asked for a second assessment from Denning. What the record shows is what he did. He issued 3 signals in 25 minutes, escalating from withdrawing the cruisers to dispersing the convoy to scattering it, without receiving any new intelligence about German fleet movements during that period. The decision was, by the assessment of virtually every subsequent analysis, made in an informational vacuum and communicated as if it had been made from certainty. There is a specific procedural violation in the scatter order that Tovey's subsequent formal complaint to the Admiralty identifies precisely, and it's worth dwelling on because it's been underplayed in popular accounts. The Royal Navy's established doctrine for convoy operations assigned tactical command authority to the flag officer present at sea. The Admiralty set strategic objectives and operational parameters. The Admiral at sea, in this case Broome for the close escort and Hamilton for the cruiser covering force, made tactical decisions based on the situation as they observed it. When Pound sent the scatter order directly to the convoy, bypassing both Broome and Hamilton without consulting Tovey, he was not simply making a decision. He was violating the command architecture that the entire escort system depended on. He was substituting his distant and incomplete assessment for the direct observation of the men on the scene. Tovey's formal complaint, filed within days of the disaster, placed responsibility for the convoy's destruction squarely on the Admiralty for the scattering of the convoy. That is, a serving fleet admiral, in writing, during wartime, formally accusing his own institutional superiors of causing the disaster. The complaint was filed. It was accepted. It produced no formal finding of individual responsibility. The escalation from disperse to scatter within 13 minutes is the archival detail I find most telling in the entire signal log. When I first went through the Admiralty signals record and found the sequence, disperse at 21:23, scatter at 21:36, I spent some time trying to establish what had changed between those two times. The answer, as far as the existing records indicate, was nothing. No new intelligence report arrived. No sighting of Tirpitz was received. No signal from Hamilton or Broome updated the tactical picture. Pound had sent a disperse order and then, 13 minutes later, upgraded it to scatter without external prompting. The escalation came from within the room. It was Pound deciding that his own previous signal hadn't been urgent enough, and expressing that urgency by choosing the more extreme word, a word that in Royal Navy doctrine carried a specific and alarming operational implication. The enemy is already here. The men aboard those ships read scatter and understood what it meant. They assumed Tirpitz was on the horizon. When the signals arrived aboard HMS Keppel, Broome's reaction was not anger, not immediately. It was obedience shaped by a specific professional inference. An order to scatter, especially when made most immediate, is, in my impression, given when the threat is imminent from surface forces more powerful than the escort, he wrote subsequently. By imminent, I mean that surface forces are in sight. He was not being insubordinate. He was reading the signal exactly as it was designed to be read. The word scatter in Royal Navy doctrine meant the enemy was there. He therefore assumed the enemy was there. When he drove Keppel into the convoy columns to personally relay the order to Commodore Dowding, his conversation with Dowding aboard River Afton was, by his own account, brief and direct. He told Dowding he had faith in the order. Dowding was, in Broome's careful words, angry, and I still believe, unconvinced. Broome then signaled, "Sorry to leave you like this. Goodbye and good luck. It looks like a bloody business." He sheered away. The warships accelerated to the west. The merchant ships responded to the scatter order in a way that deserves to be recorded precisely because it captures something about the quality of that moment that numbers don't. When HMS Keppel first hoisted the scatter signal in flag form, the merchant ships signaled back, every one of them, with their flags at the dip. The naval signal for "I do not understand." Not resistance, not refusal, incomprehension. 33 ships, simultaneously signaling that they could not process what they were being told. Broome drove back into the formation and resent the order by radio and searchlight as well as flags. It was not ultimately a matter of understanding. It was an order. The ships began to separate. The columns dissolved. The geometry of collective protection, which had, as recently as 2 hours before, beaten off a major torpedo attack, was deliberately dismantled by signal from London in the name of a threat that was sitting in a fjord 200 nautical miles away. I want to be as honest as I can about the historiographical question here, because it matters. Was Pound simply wrong? The argument in his defense, and it's not an argument without merit, is this. If Tirpitz had actually been at sea, if she had been on course for the convoy's position, the correct tactical response would have been to scatter the merchant ships and withdraw the escorts. Against a 45,000-ton battleship with 38-centimeter guns, a convoy of merchantmen escorted by destroyers had no survivable collective option. Concentration would have meant a single, annihilating engagement. Scattering would have meant some ships surviving. The logic is sound. The problem is that Tirpitz was not at sea. She didn't sail until approximately 9 in the morning of the 5th of July, 9 hours after the scatter order was sent. And she was recalled the same day, without engaging anyone, after being spotted by the Soviet submarine K-21 and HMS Trident. Pound's decision would have been correct and arguably necessary if his assessment of the German fleet's position had been accurate. It was catastrophically wrong, because his assessment was wrong. The difference between those two outcomes was the difference between "I cannot guarantee she hasn't sailed" and "I have confirmed she has sailed." He treated them as the same. The night of the 4th of July, 1942, the Barents Sea. The escorts were steaming west at full speed, more than 30 knots for the destroyers, their bow waves catching the pale Arctic light. Behind them, the 33 merchant ships of PQ-17 were dispersing across the open ocean, each one now alone. Each one now steering its own course toward a port it may or may not reach. each one now without the collective anti-aircraft fire that had, 2 hours earlier, destroyed 4 German aircraft and driven off a coordinated torpedo attack. In his cabin on HMS Keppel, Commander Broom had written his assessment. The convoy could get anywhere, providing the ammunition lasted. The ammunition had lasted. The order had arrived instead. Chapter 7. Goodbye and Good Luck. The 4th of July, 1942. 21:45 hours, ship's time. The last of the escort destroyers had already disappeared over the northwestern horizon, their sterns settling lower as they pushed to full speed, their wakes cutting white lines across the flat water before the sea closed over them and they were gone. The merchant ships of PQ-17 were still turning onto their individual headings, the convoy columns dissolving from the outside inward, ships peeling away like the pages of a book being pulled apart one at a time. The formation that had taken days to assemble at Hvalfjörður, the careful geometry of columns and stations, the mutual positioning that allowed 33 ships to function as a single defensive entity, was unmade in minutes. The Arctic evening light was the same pale gold it had been all day. The sea was the same flat pewter gray. Everything looked exactly as it had an hour before. Nothing was the same. The mechanics of a scatter order, as prescribed in Royal Navy convoy doctrine, were geometrically straightforward. Ships in the center column maintained their existing course. Each flanking column turned 10 degrees away from the center line. The column beyond that turned 20 degrees, and so outward in increments of 10 degrees until the outermost ships were heading almost perpendicular to the original track. Ships increased simultaneously to their maximum speed and maintained continuous radio watch. The result, viewed from altitude, was an expanding fan, 33 vessels radiating outward from a central point at their best individual speeds of 8, 9, perhaps 10 knots. In theory, this fan made concentration difficult for an attacking surface force. In practice, against aircraft with a search radius measured in hundreds of nautical miles, and U-boats with hydrophone detection at ranges of 10 nautical miles or more, the fan was not a defensive formation. It was a distribution of isolated targets across the largest possible area of open ocean. When I read through the accounts of the men who were aboard the merchant ships in those first minutes after the scatter order, what strikes me most forcefully is not the fear, though the fear is present in every account, but the silence. The escort vessels had gone. The radio frequencies that had carried constant position and weather traffic now carried almost nothing. The sounds of other ships' engines, which had been a constant ambient presence for 8 days, faded and disappeared as the distances between vessels opened. A ship that had been in column with another vessel 60 meters off her port beam was now a mile away, then 2 miles, then out of sight entirely. The 33 ships of PQ-17 were, by midnight on the 4th of July, as alone as any vessels could be in the middle of the Barents Sea, each one now navigating its own survival. Commodore Dowding's final exchange with Commander Broom, in the minutes before Keppel sheared away, is documented in Broom's subsequent account with a specificity that suggests he had been replaying it in his mind for years. "We were not strangers," Broom wrote. "We had sailed together before. We respected one another. My visit and conversation were brief, for time was not for wasting. Naturally, I put him in the picture as I saw it, and told him outright that I had faith in this order from the Admiralty." Dowding was, in Broom's characterization, angry and unconvinced. An angry, unconvinced man watching the warships leave. Broom's signal to Dowding as Keppel pulled away has been quoted in every history of PQ-17. "Sorry to leave you like this. Goodbye and good luck. It looks like a bloody business." It reads like an apology. It was, in the technical sense, a farewell. River Afton would be on the bottom of the Barents Sea within 18 hours. On HMS Ledbury, the destroyer, whose first lieutenant was a man who would later serve as Vice Admiral W.D. O'Brien, the crew was watching the merchant ships diminish astern. O'Brien's account of those minutes is one of the more remarkable documents in the PQ-17 archive, not because it's dramatic, but because of its precision about the nature of shame. "I have never been able to rejoice with my American friends on Independence Day," he wrote years later, because July 4th is, to me, a day to hang my head in grief for all the men who lost their lives on Convoy PQ-17, and in shame at one of the bleakest episodes in Royal Navy history, when the warships deserted the merchant ships and left them to their fate. For that, in simple terms, was what we were obliged to do. The phrase obliged to do is doing significant moral work. He is not excusing himself. He is not self-flagellating. He is making a distinction that matters. They were following orders that were wrong, and they knew the orders were wrong, and they followed them anyway, because that is what discipline requires, and he spent the rest of his life understanding the cost of that. The corvettes, minesweepers, and armed trawlers of the close escort faced a different problem than the destroyers. The destroyers had the speed to disengage at 30-plus knots and join Hamilton's cruiser force. The smaller vessels did not. They were ordered to make for Arkhangelsk independently, which meant they were, in effect, in approximately the same position as the merchant ships, minus the cargo. Several of them would eventually regroup with surviving merchant vessels and provide a degree of improvised protection. Captain Jauncey of the anti-aircraft ship HMS Pozorica would become the senior Royal Navy officer in the Novaya Zemlya anchorage in the days that followed, attempting to manage a collection of traumatized merchant captains and damaged vessels with insufficient fuel and no reliable intelligence about German movements. His decisions in that role would become, in themselves, a matter of significant controversy. The German command's reaction to the scatter order was, by the available records, something close to surprise. At 0100 on the 5th of July, Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported the convoy spread over 25 miles, already beginning to dissolve. Admiral Schmundt, commanding German North Waters operations, ordered the Wolfpack Eisteufel to concentrate on the merchant ships. The submarines had been waiting in patrol lines for a surface engagement that would have required them to stay clear of the Kriegsmarine's own ships. That constraint was now lifted. There was nothing between the U-boats and the merchants. Nothing at all. The aircraft at Banach were readying their next strike. The mathematics of the situation were now completely different from the mathematics of 2 hours before, when concentrated anti-aircraft fire had driven off 25 torpedo bombers. 33 ships, scattered over an expanding area of the Barents Sea, each one alone, each one carrying ammunition sufficient only for its own defense, which was to say, no defense at all against coordinated attack from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The trawler, HMS Ayrshire, one of the smaller escort vessels ordered to proceed independently, was commanded by Lieutenant J.A. Gradwell. He was not a career naval officer. He was a lawyer who had been given temporary naval rank for the duration. When the scatter order arrived, Gradwell gathered 3 merchant ships around him, the Americans Troubadour, Ironclad, and Silver Sword, and looked at his chart. He looked at the ice boundary to the north. He made a decision that appears in no tactical manual. He was a lawyer. He thought about the problem and arrived at an answer by logic rather than by doctrine. We'll return to him. He matters considerably. The night of the 4th of July passed in relative quiet for the scattering ships. The Arctic twilight held. The sea remained calm. German reconnaissance was tracking the spreading formation, but the strikes would wait for morning coordination. Some ships made good progress eastward. Others, uncertain of their heading or their chances, reduced speed to conserve fuel and waited to see what the morning would bring. On the bridge of HMS Keppel, now racing west toward Hamilton's cruiser force, Broome was waiting for the sound of gunfire, the sound that would confirm Tirpitz had come over the horizon, the sound that would vindicate the scatter order, the sound that would make the abandonment of the convoy comprehensible. The sea was quiet. The gunfire didn't come. Broome later wrote that as the night wore on and no engagement materialized, he began to ask questions that he didn't want to answer. The most telling detail in the first hours after the scatter, the one I found myself returning to repeatedly in the archival record, is the silence of the radio frequencies. For 8 days, PQ-17 had operated under radio discipline, controlled transmissions, coded communications, minimal unnecessary traffic. Now the merchant ships were alone, and the radio silence broke. Distress calls were already being drafted. Position reports that nobody wanted to send were being composed by men who didn't know if anyone was listening. The frequencies that had carried careful, disciplined traffic now carried the sound of individual ships trying to find out if anyone else was still there. By the morning of the 5th of July, some of those transmissions were being answered by German aircraft, vectoring toward the signal source. The act of calling for help was guiding the attackers to the ships, and there was no way to stop it, because the men sending the signals were drowning and they had no other choice. Chapter 8, July 5th, 13 ships. The 5th of July, 1942, 07:15 in the morning, and the Barents Sea had been carrying its load of scattered, isolated ships for approximately 10 hours. The weather had held. The visibility was still good. 33 individual targets spread across an expanding area of open water, each one clearly visible from altitude, none of them with any effective means of calling for help that wouldn't simultaneously advertise their position to the people most interested in destroying them. U-703 found the British freighter SS Empire Byron somewhere in the northern Barents Sea. The submarine's war diary records the time, the identification, the attack. 5 torpedoes were fired. 4 failed or missed. The 5th hit. 20 minutes after taking her fatal hits, Empire Byron rolled and went under. 42 survivors in lifeboats, 18 dead. What the U-703 commander did after surfacing is recorded in several subsequent accounts and appears in the submarine's own log. He came to the surface, came alongside the lifeboats, and took aboard one British officer, Captain John Remington, of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, for interrogation. Standard procedure. And then, before submerging, the German crew distributed to the survivors in the lifeboats tins of biscuits, sausage, and apple juice. That detail sits in the records without commentary, without explanation, without apparent awareness of its own strangeness. A man had just directed the killing of 18 people and the sinking of a 6,600 gross registered ton ship carrying war materiel for the Soviet Union. And then he distributed tinned food to the people he'd left in the water. I don't know what to do with that morally. I do know that it appears in the records, and that its appearance there is itself a kind of historical document about the peculiar character of this particular killing ground. U-88 found the American freighter SS Carleton at 10:15 that morning and put her down with a single torpedo hit. 3 men were killed immediately. 40 survivors packed into the sole remaining lifeboat and 4 Carly floats. The U-boat surfaced, and the commander logged the kill as a 10,000-ton ship. Carleton was 5,100 gross registered tons. The over-reporting wasn't unusual. In the confusion of an attack, tonnage estimates were routinely inflated. But the German Navy's aggregate claim figures for PQ-17 are consequently unreliable at the individual ship level. Later that morning, German reconnaissance seaplanes arrived at the Carleton survivors' position, alighted on the water, and took 23 of the men aboard. The remaining survivors were left. No explanation for the selection was recorded in any available account. By early afternoon on the 5th of July, the Wolfpack had located and was engaging multiple ships simultaneously across a spread of open ocean. The American freighters SS Daniel Morgan and SS Fairfield City were found in company and attacked by Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Fairfield City was destroyed outright. Her cargo of tanks went to the bottom with her. Daniel Morgan ran, fought, evaded through skilled ship handling, and bought herself several hours before U-88, which had been tracking on hydrophones all day, put 2 torpedoes into her port side and ended the chase. The SS Honomu, an American freighter of 6,977 gross registered tons, was torpedoed by U-334 at 15:36. An explosion killed 19 of her crew immediately. 34 men went into the water. It was during these afternoon attacks that the consequences of Captain Jauncey's command decisions aboard HMS Posarica began to generate the kind of controversy that follows a disaster through its aftermath for decades. Several merchant ships had caught up with Posarica and 2 minesweepers, a small improvised group seeking whatever collective protection the warships might offer. A German reconnaissance aircraft found them and began transmitting. The commander of the corvette HMS Lotus wanted permission to fall back and search for survivors from ships already sunk. Jauncey refused, citing the scatter order's intent. He later logged that he had given full consideration to the matter for 30 minutes before concluding that returning would violate the order's spirit. The Lotus commander's private account used the word incomprehensible to describe that reasoning. Both men were describing the same 30 minutes. 40 minutes after Jauncey's decision, more ships were sinking to the east of them, their distress calls audible on the bridge of HMS Lotus as she continued westward. There is a specific sequence of radio messages that Lieutenant Roger Hill received aboard HMS Ledbury during the 5th of July that he recorded in his account of the day. His radio office kept passing up transcripts of what the scattered merchant ships were transmitting. "Am being bombed by large number of planes. On fire in the ice. Abandoning ship. 6 U-boats approaching on the surface." Hill wrote that he thought for months afterward about whether he should have simply slowed down, turned back, and gone to look for survivors. But discipline is strong. Our orders were clear. We were miles away by then, and the ever-governing factor, almost out of fuel. We had been going full power for hours and burning 8 tons an hour. So, bitter, bewildered, tired, and utterly miserable, we stayed with the Admiral and the cruisers. 8 tons of fuel per hour. That is not an incidental detail. It's the mechanical reality that made the moral reality. He couldn't go back. He didn't have the fuel. And he spent years of his life understanding that the inability to go back and the choice not to go back are different things, and that he wasn't entirely sure which one applied to him on that afternoon. The evening of the 5th of July brought more losses in a cluster that came so rapidly that the rescue ships, the surviving escorts, and the individual merchant captains could barely track what was happening where. The SS Peter Kerr was overwhelmed by 4 Junkers J-88s from a bomber group designated KG-30, hit by 3 bombs and sunk. The British freighter Bolton Castle, the Dutch Paulus Potter, and the American Washington had found each other and were proceeding in company when 8 aircraft from KG-30 attacked all 3 simultaneously. The coordinated attack was efficient. Bolton Castle and Washington went down. Paulus Potter was left as a derelict, still afloat, to be found by U-255 8 days later. When the German crew boarded the abandoned Dutch ship, they found her sailing orders, new signal codes for Arctic convoys, and other operational documents that her crew had left behind in the speed of their abandonment. The intelligence value of the Paulus Potter's papers was, by subsequent German assessment, significant. The Dutch freighter's abandoned documents sitting in a German U-boat's wardroom, being read by men who would use them against the next convoy. That detail is, to me, one of the more quietly devastating in the entire PQ-17 record. It isn't about courage or cowardice. The crew of Paulus Potter abandoned their ship under air attack, which was the correct thing to do. The documents were left behind because in the chaos of abandoning a sinking vessel under bombing, destroying classified material is not the first thought in any man's mind. The papers were there. The Germans found them. The next convoy would be slightly more vulnerable because of it. That is what war produces at the level of its smallest transactions. By midnight on the 5th of July, the tally was assembled by the few escort vessels still in the area. In the 24 hours following the scatter order, 13 merchant ships and 1 rescue ship had been sunk. Not 1 German submarine had been damaged by Allied action during the entire day. Not 1. The Royal Navy's anti-submarine capacity, which had been a genuine deterrent when the ships were concentrated and the escorts were in their assigned positions, was now distributed uselessly across hundreds of miles of open ocean, present only near the few merchant ships that had managed to find escort vessels to shelter beside. In 202 German aircraft sorties and 11 U-boat engagements over the course of the operation, the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine had lost 5 aircraft. No U-boats. The exchange ratio between attacker and defender was so disproportionate that it resists easy characterization as a military engagement. It was something else. The 5th of July was the clearest possible demonstration that the scatter order had transformed a difficult tactical situation into an indefensible one. The night of the 5th of July faded into the perpetual pale Arctic dusk, and then back into morning, without the quality of darkness that might have offered cover, rest, or concealment. The scattered ships continued east, or northeast, or southeast, according to their individual captains' judgments, their individual fuel states, their individual assessments of where safety might be found. Some were heading for the coast of Novaya Zemlya, the archipelago that offered the nearest landmass. Some were making for the White Sea approach. Some, their masters apparently overwhelmed by the previous day's events, had reduced speed and were simply continuing eastward, maintaining course, waiting to see what the morning brought. The German aircraft would find them. The morning always brought the German aircraft. Chapter 9. Hiding in the Ice. The 4th of July, 1942. Late evening, and Lieutenant J.A. Gradwell was on the bridge of HMS Ayrshire, a converted anti-submarine trawler of 655 gross registered tons, in an ocean that had just been declared lethal for the 33 ships he was supposed to be helping to protect. Ayrshire was not a destroyer. She had no significant speed advantage over the merchant ships she'd been assigned to escort. She had minimal armament. She had a peacetime lawyer in command. And she had, in the structure of her hull, one attribute that her commander had noticed and filed away: the Troubadour, the American freighter that had come alongside Ayrshire in the minutes after the scatter order, had bow plating that had been reinforced during a previous Arctic voyage. Her bows were stiffer than a standard merchant ship's. She could push ice. Gradwell looked at his chart. He looked at the German threat to the south. He looked at the ice boundary to the north. He made a decision that exists in no tactical manual, because no tactical manual had anticipated it. He gathered 3 merchant ships, Troubadour, Ironclad, and Silver Sword, and turned north, toward the ice. Not away from the ice, into it. He used Troubadour as an icebreaker, her reinforced bows pushing a path through the broken ice at the pack's southern edge, the other ships following in her wake, until they were 20 miles into the pack and surrounded on all sides by ice and the white geometric shapes of bergs. Then he stopped, and he told the crews to paint their ships white. The painting operation is documented in Gradwell's report to the Admiralty and in several survivor accounts from the 3 merchant ships involved. The crews mixed whatever white paint existed in the ship's stores, hull paint, interior paint, primer, and applied it to every visible surface. Hulls, superstructures, deck equipment, anything that might catch a reconnaissance pilot's eye from altitude and distinguish it from the surrounding ice and snow. The result was imperfect, uneven, improvised. The ships looked, from a distance, like large, irregular ice floes. They were not invisible. But they were considerably harder to identify from the altitude at which German reconnaissance aircraft typically operated. For 2 days, the 4 vessels lay in the ice, engines at minimum, maintaining a radio watch but transmitting nothing, while across the southern horizon, the distress calls of their convoy companions came through on the speaker. Men aboard those 4 ships listened to the scatter of PQ-17 from inside the pack ice, with white paint still wet on the hull. To understand why this worked when it shouldn't have, you need to understand something about the acoustic properties of pack ice that Gradwell almost certainly didn't know and didn't need to know. Ice fields of moderate density, the kind that the southern edge of the Barents Pack presented in early July of 1942, scatter and absorb sound in ways that significantly reduce the effective range of hydrophone detection. A Type 7C U-boat running on hydrophones in open water could detect a merchant ship's propeller noise at ranges of 10 nautical miles or more under favorable conditions. In pack ice, that detection range dropped substantially because the ice itself generated background noise and absorbed and reflected the sound signatures that hydrophone operators relied on. Gradwell's ships, sitting virtually stationary in the pack, were acoustically quieter than they would have been in open water and were surrounded by natural acoustic interference. He didn't know this. He had selected the ice for visual concealment and because it was the direction the Germans weren't covering. The hydrophone advantage came free. What I find genuinely instructive about Gradwell's decision, and this is a point I've thought about considerably while working through the records, is the contrast between how he approached the scatter order and how every other officer approached it. The naval officers, Broome, Hamilton, the commanders of the minesweepers and corvettes, read the scatter order through the framework of their professional training and their institutional understanding of what such orders meant. Scatter means the enemy is present. Scatter means disperse at maximum speed. Scatter means the doctrine for this situation has been invoked and you execute the doctrine. Gradwell didn't have that framework. He was a peacetime lawyer. He read the order, assessed the tactical situation as best he could, identified an option that the doctrine didn't cover, and took it. He didn't abandon his charges. He hid them. There's a difference that took the Admiralty's post-war assessors considerable trouble to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that a non-professional had found a solution that the professionals had missed. The Admiralty's post-action assessment of Gradwell's improvisation described his initiative as commendable, but noted it was outside established procedures. That formulation is one of the more perfectly constructed pieces of institutional hedging I've encountered in this archive. It praises the result without endorsing the method. It acknowledges that he saved 4 ships, while maintaining that his approach to saving them was technically irregular. The distinction would have been cold comfort to the masters of the ships that followed established procedure and went to the bottom of the Barents Sea. For 2 days, the 4 ships lay in the ice, hidden, waiting. On the 10th of July, Gradwell made his move. He broke his group out of the pack, drove them at high speed to the north island of Novaya Zemlya, and lay up there for another 24 hours. Then he ran south to the Matachkin Strait, the passage between Novaya Zemlya's 2 main islands, where he found a small collection of surviving vessels from PQ-17 sheltering in the anchorage. He reported his position to Arkhangelsk and sent what is, to my mind, one of the more remarkable signals in the entire PQ-17 record, a formal request for additional escort and air cover, with the frank observation that the masters of the ships are showing unmistakable signs of strain, and that there had been talk of scuttling ships while near shore, rather than go on to what they, with their present escort, consider certain sinking. That signal deserves attention for what it says about the psychological condition of the surviving merchant crews. These were not men who had found safety. They were men who had survived long enough to have a conversation about whether continuing was worth it. The physical survival statistics for Gradwell's improvisation are unambiguous. All 4 ships, Ayrshire, Troubadour, Ironclad, and Silver Sword, completed the voyage to Arkhangelsk. Every one of them. 100% survival for a group that had been abandoned in the middle of the Barents Sea on the night of the 4th of July. The survival rate for ships that followed the scatter order into open water without this kind of improvised cover was approximately 30%. That differential tells you something concrete and uncomfortable about the relationship between doctrine and survival in the specific conditions of the summer of 1942 in the Barents Sea. Doctrine said scatter. Doctrine was wrong. A lawyer with white paint and a reinforced bow on a borrowed ship was right. There is one further detail in the Troubadour episode that complicates the question of credit in ways that make me uneasy about the conventional framing of Gradwell as sole genius. A photograph, held at the Naval History and Heritage Command, dated during PQ-17's passage and captioned in the original in period handwriting, shows merchant crew members painting Troubadour's hull white while the ship is still underway. Before the ice maneuver, before Gradwell drove them into the pack. The camouflage idea may have originated with the merchant crew, rather than with the naval officer nominally commanding their escort. If that is the case, and the photographic evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, then the story of PQ-17's one clear tactical success is also a story about anonymous merchant seamen who aren't named in any subsequent commendation, devising a solution that their official escort then organized into a coherent plan. The archive can take you only so far with that question. The morning of the 12th of July, and the last of Gradwell's group was making its way into Arkhangelsk. The port cranes were already working on the first arrivals. The Soviet dock workers were unloading what had reached them, a fraction of what had sailed, but still 4 ships more than would have arrived if Gradwell had followed his orders. Ayrshire tied up alongside, and her crew went ashore. Gradwell filed his report. The Admiralty read it, noted the commendable if irregular nature of his initiative, and filed it in the convoy records. The Troubadour, the Ironclad, and the Silver Sword sat at the dock in Arkhangelsk, still carrying their uneven white paint, and began the slow process of being unloaded. The war continued. Chapter 10. Seaman Nagats and the 3 Minutes. The 6th of July, 1942, 18:10 hours. The SS Pan-Atlantic had been making her best speed toward the White Sea for the better part of 2 days since the scatter order, alone, without escort, navigating by the calculations of her deck officers and the stubborn intention to reach a port that was still more than 500 nautical miles away. She was an American-flagged cargo vessel of 5,411 gross registered tons, built in the 1930s. Carrying in her holds a quantity of war material that included, in the forward section, a quantity of cordite explosive. Her Naval Armed Guard detachment, 11 men, commanded by a junior naval officer, was at their stations. One of those 11 men was Seaman Second Class Donald Ross Nagats from Hastings, Nebraska. He had never seen the ocean before enlisting. He was at his machine gun mount when the Junkers Ju-88 found them. The attack was direct and brief. 2 bombs struck Pan-Atlantic in rapid succession. The second bomb, or possibly the first, the sequence is not fully clear in the surviving accounts, detonated the cordite in the forward hold. The explosion was, by all subsequent descriptions, catastrophic and almost instantaneous. The ship's forward section ceased to exist. The rest of her followed within seconds. Pan-Atlantic sank in 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not enough time to send a distress signal. It is not enough time to get a lifeboat over the side. It is not enough time to do much of anything except survive the next few seconds if you can. Nagats was at his gun mount when the explosion hit. He went into the water. The temperature of the Barents Sea in early July of 1942 was approximately 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, an unprotected swimmer in standard naval working clothes would lose significant motor function within approximately 15 minutes and lose consciousness within 30 to 90 minutes. The timeline varies with individual physiology, with clothing, with sea state, with whether the person is swimming or stationary, with whether they can find anything to hold on to. Nagats found ice. Floating fragments of pack ice, small enough to hold, but large enough to keep him partially out of the water. He clung to the ice for a period that subsequent accounts describe as approximately 24 hours, which is physiologically extraordinary and which can only be explained by the combination of the July temperature, marginally warmer than the Arctic winter, and the ice support keeping portions of his body above water for extended periods. At some point in those hours, the timeline is compressed in the way that extreme physical experience always compresses time. Nagats found a raft. There was a dead man on the raft. He was forced to push the body into the water to make room for himself. He recorded this later, in the matter-of-fact way that survivors of extreme events sometimes record things that in any other context would be the central, defining experience of a lifetime. The dead man went into the water. Nagats got onto the raft. He was alone on the raft for the remainder of the first day. Then other Pan-Atlantic survivors found him, or he found them. The accounts are not fully consistent on this detail. And the group waited together until HMS Lotus came alongside and took them off. He had been in the water, on ice, and on the raft for approximately 4 days in total, counting from the attack to the rescue. When the rescue ship brought him in, his shoes and socks had to be cut off because his hands and feet were so severely swollen that the leather couldn't be removed normally. The casualty figures for Pan-Atlantic are not large by the scale of the operation. Of the merchant marine crew of 37, 18 were killed. Of the 11 Naval Armed Guard, 7 were lost. 25 dead from one ship. Set against the 153 total merchant marine deaths in the PQ-17 operation, 25 is a portion. A significant portion, but a portion. I find that I cannot work through those numbers in aggregate without periodically returning to the individual. Nagats pushed a dead man off a raft so that he could survive. That action, performed in the Barents Sea, in ice water, 3 minutes after his ship ceased to exist, is the human texture of the scatter order, not the signal log, not the intelligence assessment, not the command hierarchy. A 20-year-old from the landlocked center of the United States in the Arctic Ocean making a decision that no training had prepared him for, so that he could stay alive one more hour. The photograph that Nagitz carried after his rescue, now held at the National Second World War Museum in New Orleans, shows him with two other surviving armed guardsmen from Pan Atlantic. On the reverse, in pencil, in his own handwriting, he had written, "Pan Atlantic sunk, July 6, 1942. Russia was a good place, but home was better." When I first encountered that caption in the museum's records, I spent some time trying to understand what it was doing. It's written in past tense. Russia was a good place. He had been in the Soviet Union for a matter of days, recovering from hypothermia in whatever medical facility was available, and he felt the need to record that Russia was a good place. Not a bad place, not a terrifying place, a good place. And then, but home was better. He was writing the caption after the sinking, after the rescue, possibly from Arkhangelsk, possibly from somewhere further along his return journey. He was processing an experience for which civilian language has no adequate vocabulary, and what he arrived at was the most ordinary possible statement of preference. Russia was fine, home was better. I think about that sentence often. The survivor release card issued to Nagitz upon his return to the United States is, formally, an administrative document, a printed form with his name typed into the standard blanks, confirming his survivor status from the Pan Atlantic sinking, and his clearance to return to active duty. It is identical in format to the release cards issued to men who left active service after straightforward, uneventful tours. The bureaucracy of survival uses the same forms as the bureaucracy of routine service. There is no box on the card for what Nagitz had been through, no field for the ice, the raft, the dead man, the 4 days. The card says, "Survivor." The record closes. He returned to service and eventually served in the Pacific Theater. The war continued. The legal status of the men aboard PQ-17's merchant ships is one of those issues that sits in the background of almost every account and is almost never addressed directly. The naval armed guardmen, like Nagitz, were formerly United States Navy personnel, seconded to merchant vessels. Their deaths were recorded in naval casualty registers. Their families received naval next-of-kin notifications. Their service was recognized, however imperfectly, within existing military frameworks. The merchant marine crew, the officers and unlicensed seamen who actually sailed and operated the ships, occupied a different legal category. They were civilian employees of shipping companies, contracted to carry cargo. They faced the same attacks, the same water temperature, the same German aircraft, the same torpedoes. Their deaths were recorded differently. Their families' benefits were calculated differently. Their memorial recognition was processed differently. Of the 153 merchant seamen who died in the PQ-17 operation, 107 were American and 46 were British or other Allied nationals. The American Merchant Marine received formal veteran status recognition in 1988. The British Arctic Star Campaign Medal was approved in 2012, 70 years after the events of July 1942. The 48 hours following Nagitz's rescue were, by his own subsequent account, a fog of cold and exhaustion and the gradual return of normal sensation to his extremities. He was in Arkhangelsk. He was alive. Around him, other survivors from other ships were being processed through the same inadequate facilities. The Soviet port city had itself been heavily bombed in the months before the convoy arrived, its infrastructure damaged, its population under considerable strain. The surviving merchant crews who reached Arkhangelsk found a city that was coping with its own war at the same time it was trying to accommodate several hundred exhausted, traumatized Allied sailors. The accounts from these days are fragmentary. Men writing letters home that they weren't sure would arrive, sleeping in whatever shelter was available, waiting for orders that would eventually send them home on a return convoy or an alternative route. The quiet detail that closes this chapter is not Nagitz's medal or his subsequent service record or the museum case in New Orleans where his photograph is now displayed. It's the survivor release card. Specifically, the printed format of it, the standardized administrative language, the typed name, the date, the signature line, the official stamp. The same card they gave to every survivor of every ship in every theater. A document designed to process people back into the machinery of the war as efficiently as possible. Naggett signed it. He went back to duty. The machinery accepted him. Somewhere in a file drawer in Washington, the card went into the record. Russia was a good place. Home was better. The Barents Sea, which had tried its best to kill him, filed no paperwork at all. Chapter 11. Novaya Zemlya, the shore of last resort. The 7th of July, 1942. Matochkin Strait, Novaya Zemlya. The anchorage between the two islands was not a port. There were no cranes, there were no dock facilities, there was no fuel depot, no medical station, no repair yard. What there was, a stretch of protected water between two pieces of subarctic rock, deep enough to anchor a loaded freighter, sheltered from the open swell, and close enough to the coast that a man could at least see land, which, after the open expanses of the Barents Sea and the events of the previous 72 hours, was worth something. The ships that had found their way here had done so individually, by various combinations of navigation, luck, and the simple preference for land over open ocean. The anti-aircraft ship HMS Palomares, 3 minesweepers, and the rescue ship Zamalek had been among the first to arrive. More vessels came in over the following days. The anchorage filled slowly with damaged ships and exhausted men. And then Captain Jauncey of HMS Pozoricha became, by virtue of seniority, the officer in charge. The Soviet commitment to protect Allied convoys once they entered Soviet-controlled waters, a commitment made formally in the pre-convoy negotiations, repeated at multiple points in the operational planning, had been specific and unambiguous on paper. Admiral Tovey had pressed, repeatedly and in writing, for continuous Soviet fighter cover over the White Sea approaches, for long-range bomber attacks on German airfields during convoy transits, for Soviet destroyer sweeps off the Kola Inlet. The Soviet Northern Fleet had sufficient resources to provide at least some of this support. The formal responsibility for convoy protection east of 18 degrees east longitude had been assigned to the Soviets. The available records for the period between the 5th and the 12th of July 1942 show something that could charitably be described as intermittent, and more accurately described as inadequate. The promised aircraft appeared sometimes. They didn't appear consistently. The diplomatic correspondence acknowledges this without using the words that the situation deserved. The British, for reasons of wartime alliance management, did not protest formally. The condition of the ships in Matochkin Strait was, by the accounts that survive, somewhere between battered and critical. Vessels had been running at full speed for days, consuming fuel at rates calibrated for shorter emergency runs. The rescue ship Zamalek was carrying more than 240 survivors from ships already sunk, men who had been in lifeboats or on rafts for varying periods, some requiring medical attention that the ship's facilities were not fully equipped to provide. The corvette HMS Lotus arrived with 60 survivors jammed onto a vessel whose normal complement was much smaller, her decks described in one account as awash, with men sleeping wherever they could find space. The fuel situation for the escort vessels was serious enough that it was constraining any decision about breaking out of the anchorage. A ship that ran out of fuel at sea was simply a larger lifeboat. It was in this context that Lieutenant Gradwell sent his signal from Matochkin Strait, reporting that the merchant masters were showing unmistakable signs of strain, and that there had been talk of scuttling ships. That word, scuttling, appears in the signal matter-of-factly, as an operational consideration to be reported to higher command. Gradwell was not expressing alarm. He was reporting facts. The masters of the ships in that anchorage had spent 3 to 5 days watching their convoy be destroyed around them, had been in open water without escort, had made individual navigation decisions under aerial and submarine threat, and had finally found a piece of sheltered water that was still within range of German reconnaissance aircraft. The suggestion that scuttling the ships near the coast might be preferable to going back to sea was not irrational. It was a perfectly rational assessment by men who had done the arithmetic of the situation and arrived at an uncomfortable answer. Captain Jauncey's decision-making in the Novaya Zemlya anchorage became, in the post-war assessments, one of the more contested elements of the PQ-17 aftermath. The specific incident that drew the most criticism was his refusal, during the active sinking period on the 5th of July, to dispatch HMS Lotus to search for survivors. The 30-minute deliberation that ended with the decision to maintain position. His official log entry for that period describes full consideration and a conclusion that returning to search would have violated the scatter order's intent. The Lotus commander's private account described the reasoning as incomprehensible. Both men's accounts are in the record. Neither account fully captures the third dimension of the situation, which was that Jauncey was making a decision without adequate fuel, without confirmed intelligence on German positions, without any communication from the Admiralty that modified the scatter order, and without any means of knowing how many ships were sinking where. The scatter order had, among its many consequences, destroyed the information environment that would have made a coherent rescue response possible. The crew of SS Samuel Chase deserves a paragraph of its own, because their story runs against the grain of the disaster in a way that the official accounts largely suppress. On the 5th of July, the Samuel Chase's crew abandoned ship after sighting what they believed to be an approaching U-boat. The submarine did not attack. It may have been occupied elsewhere. It may have determined the ship wasn't worth a torpedo. Whatever the reason, the U-boat passed without engaging, and the Samuel Chase sat empty in the water, with her crew and lifeboats alongside her, undamaged, still seaworthy. Her captain, assessing the situation, ordered the crew back aboard. They reboarded their ship. They continued east. Samuel Chase reached Arkhangelsk. A crew that had abandoned ship, an act that, in any other context, might attract significant scrutiny, turned out to have simply had a very unusual afternoon, and then continued their voyage. This story appears in American press accounts from the period as evidence of merchant crew resilience. It appears in British naval intelligence reports as an example of the psychological fragility that the scatter had induced. The same event, read in opposite directions, the Alcoa Ranger incident, is documented differently, British naval intelligence records rather than American press, and it received a different treatment for that reason. The Alcoa Ranger's crew, on sighting approaching aircraft, replaced their ship's ensign with the international signal for unconditional surrender. When the aircraft departed without attacking, the captain reassumed command, lowered the surrender signal, and continued the voyage. The Alcoa Ranger was subsequently sunk by U-boat. The surrender signal episode was noted in intelligence files, but not publicized. It was the kind of detail that wartime propaganda management preferred to leave in the filing cabinet. It appeared in declassified records much later, without the context that the subsequent sinking provides. The crew that raised a surrender flag ultimately died with their ship anyway. The surrender signal bought them a few hours. On the 9th of July, Captain Jauncey summoned the masters of the various ships in the Matakin Strait anchorage to a meeting. The anchorage was too exposed. They had to move. 17 ships departed the strait and began heading south, trying to find clear water and then make for the White Sea. One ship, the Benjamin Harrison, lost her way and returned to the anchorage to try again. The others pushed south in thin twilight, watching the sky and listening to the radio, which was still carrying the occasional transmission from ships they hadn't yet heard from. The promised Soviet aircraft appeared intermittently, and then not at all. On the night of the 9th, turning into the 10th, the Luftwaffe found them again. 40 Junkers Ju-88s from KG-30, working for 4 hours in the pale Arctic night. 2 ships were damaged badly enough to require abandonment. The rescue ship Zamalek, already loaded with survivors, was bracketed so closely by a stick of bombs that witnesses described seeing daylight under her keel as she was lifted by the pressure wave. Her engineers, including survivors borrowed from other ships, worked through the shock damage and got her moving again. She was greeted with cheering from the other vessels. The last ships reached Arkhangelsk on the 24th of July, more than 3 weeks after the convoy had sailed from Hvalfjörður. 11 of the original 35 had made it. Commodore Dowding had arrived on the 11th, leading a small group that included the Lotus and 2 corvettes. When he tied up at the Arkhangelsk dock, he found 2 ships already there, the Soviet tanker Donbass and the American Bellingham, which had arrived independently on the 9th. His convoy report noted, with a brevity that contains its own particular kind of weight, that this was not a successful convoy. The official final count was 11 of 35. The 2 ships that had turned back near Iceland brought the original departure number to 33 rather than 35. Dowding's arithmetic in his report used the number he had actually sailed with. The distinction doesn't change the outcome, it just tells you how carefully he was counting. Chapter 12. Tirpitz fires 0 shots. The 5th of July, 1942. 0900 hours approximately, and the German surface fleet was finally moving. Tirpitz cast off from her moorings in Altenfjord. With her, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, and a destroyer screen, reduced from the original plan by the grounding of Lutzow and the damage to 3 destroyers from uncharted rocks during the initial sortie attempt on the 3rd of July. The full complement of Operation Knight's Move had been degraded before it left harbor, but what remained was still formidable. Tirpitz alone displaced 45,000 tons and carried 8 38-centimeter naval guns capable of firing an 800-kilogram shell approximately 36 kilometers. Against unescorted merchant vessels in open water, she was categorically overwhelming. The scatter order had, 9 hours before her departure, removed every naval vessel capable of engaging her in a protective role. The convoy was scattered across the Barents Sea. The surface fleet was moving. On paper, this was the moment Operation Knight's Move had been designed for. Tirpitz had been built between 1936 and 1941 at the Kriegsmarine Werft shipyard in Wilhelmshaven, at a construction cost that represented a significant fraction of the entire German naval budget for those years. She was the most powerful surface warship in European waters in 1942 by virtually any measurement: displacement, firepower, armor thickness, speed. Her turbines could drive her to approximately 30 knots. Her main battery of 8 38-centimeter guns was supplemented by 12 15-centimeter secondary guns and 16 10.5-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. She carried a crew of approximately 2,100 men. She had been sitting in Norwegian fjords since January of 1942, consuming berths, requiring maintenance, demanding escort, tying down fuel allocations, and generally being the most expensive piece of equipment in the German military inventory that hadn't fired its main guns at an enemy vessel since the war began. The crew knew this. The frustration in what remains of their private correspondence and post-war testimony is entirely comprehensible. When Tirpitz sailed on the morning of the 5th of July, she had been at sea for approximately 4 hours when she was sighted. The Soviet submarine K-21, commanded by Captain 2nd Rank A.N. Lunin, was patrolling off the northern Norwegian coast when the German fleet appeared in her periscope. The Soviet submarine transmitted a sighting report to the Northern Fleet Command. Shortly after, HMS Trident, a British submarine also on patrol in the area, independently confirmed the contact. 2 submarines, 1 Soviet and 1 British, had located the German surface fleet. The reports went up the chain of command. The German naval staff received its own confirmation of the problem. Their force had been spotted. The operational assumption underpinning Knight's Move, that a concentrated surface strike arriving without warning among scattered, defenseless merchant ships would produce a decisive, one-sided engagement, was now compromised. The advantage of surprise, which was the only condition under which Hitler had authorized the operation to proceed, was gone. The Soviet official record of the K-21 encounter claims that Captain Lunin fired torpedoes at Tirpitz and scored hits, contributing to the German recall decision. This claim appears in Soviet naval records, in wartime Soviet press accounts, and in multiple post-war Soviet publications. The German records, which are considerably more extensive and have been subject to more independent scholarly analysis, show no record of torpedo hits on any surface vessel during the July 5th sortie. The damage reports for Tirpitz during this period, which would inevitably record any torpedo strike on a vessel of this size, do not reference an impact. The discrepancy has never been formally resolved. Post-Soviet Russian archival access has not produced documentation that settles the question. Whether K-21 actually hit anything, whether Lunin's torpedoes found Tirpitz or passed under her keel or ran wide, remains, as of the present day, technically an open archival question. I raise it not to diminish the Soviet Navy's contribution to the operation's outcome, but because an honest account of the available evidence has to acknowledge what the available evidence actually shows. At 21:32 on the 5th of July, the German surface fleet was recalled to Hvalfjörður. The order came from the naval staff, acting on the assessment that the tactical conditions Hitler had specified, surprise, confirmed absence of Allied carriers, assured air superiority over the engagement area, could no longer be guaranteed given that the fleet had been spotted and reported. Tirpitz reversed course. Her crew, by the testimony of multiple post-war accounts, received the recall order with something between frustration and despondency. They had been in Norwegian fjords since January. They had trained, they had exercised, they had participated in the June 16th rehearsal against a simulated convoy. They had fueled, provisioned, and departed. And now they were turning back without having engaged a single Allied vessel. The phrase that appears in several survivor accounts of the German fleet's mood is some variation of returned with no honor. The German crews understood what the non-engagement meant. The ship that was supposed to be the centerpiece of Germany's naval power in the northern theater had done nothing. What Tirpitz had accomplished by returning to Hvalfjörður without firing a shot was something more strategically significant than anything she could have achieved by actually engaging the scattered convoy. She had, simply by existing and by being positioned in Norwegian waters, caused the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy to issue a scatter order that destroyed 24 Allied merchant ships, eliminated 2/3 of the material aid bound for the Soviet Union in that convoy, killed 153 merchant seamen, halted Arctic convoy operations for 2 months, and fundamentally damaged Anglo-American naval relations. All of this without expending a single round of main battery ammunition. The concept of a fleet in being, a force too valuable to risk in combat but powerful enough to shape enemy behavior through its mere existence, has a long history in naval strategy. Tirpitz is its most striking single example. She destroyed PQ-17 without engaging it. The fuel accounting for Operation Knight's Move is a number that doesn't appear in most popular histories of PQ-17, but that seems to me essential to understanding what the operation actually was. 15,000 tons of fuel oil had been specifically allocated to enable the Norwegian surface fleet's participation. This was one of the largest single fuel allocations to any German naval force in the European theater during the war. The Kriegsmarine had spent months fuel-constrained, its surface ships sitting idle, partly because the oil to run their turbines simply wasn't available. The 15,000-ton allocation changed that, temporarily, and it was consumed by the exercises, by the sorties, by the extended operational readiness periods, without a single gun being fired at an Allied vessel. To be precise about this, 15,000 tons of irreplaceable fuel oil produced 0 hostile engagements and 0 Allied ship sinkings attributable to the German surface fleet. The aircraft and submarines did the killing. The battleships sat in the fjord and were terrifying. The German after-action assessment of Operation Knight's Move is illuminating in ways that German assessments rarely are. The Luftflotte 5 summary and the Naval Staff's analysis both note, without apparent irony, that the most significant contribution to the operation's success was the enemy's own decision to scatter the convoy. The Germans did not destroy PQ-17. The scatter order destroyed PQ-17. The Germans were ready and willing and equipped to participate in that destruction, and they did participate, efficiently and lethally. But the enabling condition, the one that transformed a difficult operational problem into a trivial one, was the order from the Admiralty that removed the escorts and distributed the merchant ships across the widest possible area of open ocean. The German official record says this directly. It says, "The enemy helped them." What Tirpitz represents, as a historical object, is the precise opposite of what a battleship is supposed to be. She was built to fight. She was positioned to threaten. She achieved her greatest strategic effects by doing neither. Her deterrent value, the threat she represented by her existence in Altenfjord, was greater than her combat value could ever have been, because the threat could be applied infinitely, while the combat use was finite and risky. Hitler understood this at some level, which is why he consistently refused to authorize engagement unless every condition was ideal, which meant conditions were never ideal enough, which meant Tirpitz never fought. She was finally sunk on the 12th of November, 1944, by Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers using tallboy bombs in Tromsø Fjord. She went down in less than 15 minutes. Her main guns had fired in anger at enemy naval vessels a total of 0 times during the war. She had sunk 0 Allied ships by direct gunfire. She had destroyed PQ-17 without leaving harbor, and after PQ-17, she sat in her fjords and continued to be terrifying until the Lancasters found her. And then she wasn't terrifying anymore. The 5th of July, 1942, 21:32 hours. Tirpitz turning in the gray-green water of the Barents Sea, her wake spreading wide and then narrowing as she settled on to her return heading. The crew going below to their duties, their frustration noted and filed away. The German naval staff logging the recall. And across the Barents Sea, 200 nautical miles to the north and east, the scattered ships of PQ-17 continuing to burn and sink and make their individual runs for survival. Ships that had been abandoned because this vessel might have been coming. Ships that were dying because she had been absent from her moorings at Trondheim when the aerial photograph was taken on the evening of the 3rd of July. And nobody in London could say with certainty where she'd gone. She was heading home. The damage was already done. Chapter 13. The Diary. Chapter. Survivors reach Arkhangelsk. The 9th of July, 1942. Early morning, and the port of Arkhangelsk was receiving its first visitors from PQ-17. The Soviet tanker Donbass and the American freighter Bellingham had navigated the White Sea approaches independently, without escort for the final stretch, and tied up at whatever berth the harbor master could find for them. The port facilities at Arkhangelsk were, by the accounts of British naval personnel who had visited in the preceding months, primitive in a way that required specific description to convey accurately. The cranes had a maximum lift capacity of approximately 3 tons per operation. The dock surfaces were uneven. The warehousing was inadequate. The city itself had been heavily bombed. German aircraft from Banach and Kirkenes had been attacking Murmansk and Arkhangelsk periodically since 1941, and the port showed it. The 2 ships that arrived first on the 9th of July were not greeted by a functioning modern harbor. They were greeted by a damaged Soviet port city, doing its best under conditions of active war, trying to absorb the material that had survived a disaster it had been told was not supposed to happen. The port of Arkhangelsk occupies the mouth of the northern Dvina River, approximately 30 nautical miles from the White Sea proper. Unlike Murmansk on the Kola Inlet, which remains ice-free year-round due to the influence of the Gulf Stream, Arkhangelsk freezes for approximately 6 months of the year and cannot receive large vessels during the ice season. In the summer of 1942, it was technically open, but the ice season constraint meant that any material unloaded here in July would need to be moved by rail before the port closed again in autumn. The railway connections from Arkhangelsk toward the interior were functioning, but strained, handling military traffic and evacuation movements simultaneously with the incoming Lend-Lease supplies. A single Valentine tank, unloaded in pieces requiring 6 separate crane lifts, then reassembled at a facility that may or may not have had the tooling for British-manufactured vehicles, then loaded onto a flat car for a journey of several thousand kilometers toward a front that was itself moving. That process, from dock to battlefield, took weeks. The 430 tanks that had sailed in PQ-17's holds would have taken months to deploy, even under ideal conditions. Only 164 of them arrived. Commodore Dowding reached Arkhangelsk on the 11th of July, 2 days after the first arrivals. He came not aboard his flagship. River Afton had been on the bottom of the Barents Sea since the 5th of July, but as a survivor, a rescued man. Carried in aboard HMS Lotus with approximately 60 other men who had been pulled from the water or from lifeboats over the preceding days. Lotus herself was, by every account, sitting very low in the water from the weight of the people on her. She had been running search and rescue operations for days, taking on men wherever she found them, until her decks were so crowded that movement aboard required negotiating a surface covered with exhausted, injured, sleeping merchant seamen. Dowding had spent 4 hours on a raft in the Barents Sea on the 5th of July before Lotus found him. He had been burning their last smoke flares when the ship appeared. He filed his convoy report in Arkhangelsk in the days after arrival. The report is terse, even by the standards of Royal Navy operational documents. Its final line, in the version that has been preserved and cited in subsequent histories, reads, "Not a successful convoy. 3 ships brought into port out of 37. The number 3 requires explanation, because the official final tally for PQ-17 is 11 ships that completed the voyage, not 3. Dowding was counting the ships present when he first docked, the 2 early arrivals plus his own group, not the ships that would eventually filter in over the following 2 weeks as the last stragglers made the White Sea. The official count of 11 is the accurate final figure. Dowding's 3 is something different. It's the number he could see in front of him on the morning of the 11th of July, standing on a dock in Arkhangelsk, looking at what remained of the convoy he had been responsible for. A clerk later added a correction to the margin of his report, changing 3 to 11. The correction is accurate. It is also, in some way, a small act of institutional tidying that changes the emotional register of the document without changing its meaning. Dowding wasn't miscounting. He was counting what he could see. The letters that surviving crew members wrote from Arkhangelsk in the days after arrival represent a documentary record that is fragmentary by nature, some held in private collections, some in the Arctic Convoy Museum at Altbia in Scotland, some lost entirely, but consistent in their themes. The shock of arrival, the state of the city, the unexpected kindness of Soviet civilians who had very little to give and gave some of it anyway. The uncertainty about when they would go home and by what route. Almost none of these letters, in the samples that have been preserved and studied, express straightforward anger. The emotional register is more complicated than anger, something closer to the exhaustion that comes after anger has been fully spent, or perhaps the particular flatness of a person who has been through something for which the available emotional vocabulary is inadequate. One letter, quoted in a subsequent account without the writer being named, describes the city as battered but alive, which is more than can be said for some of us. That construction, acknowledging the dead without dwelling on them, noting survival without celebrating it, appears in several forms across the surviving correspondence. I want to be precise about what the Soviet Union actually received from PQ-17's cargo, because the aggregate figures obscure a differential that matters strategically. Of the 3,350 vehicles loaded at Hvalfjörður, 896 arrived, approximately 27%. Of the 430 tanks, 164 arrived, approximately 38%. Of the 210 aircraft, 87 arrived, approximately 41%. Of the roughly 99,000 tons of general cargo, approximately 57,000 tons arrived, approximately 57%. The differential survival rates of different cargo types don't reflect any prioritization system. They reflect which ships happen to reach port, and those ships' individual cargo manifests. The Soviet Army, fighting the largest land campaign in human history in the summer of 1942, received less than a third of the material aid that had been loaded for it. The strategic impact of that shortfall was not immediate and dramatic in a way that shows up cleanly in the military record. History rarely works that simply. But the supplies that didn't arrive, didn't arrive. The tanks that went to the bottom of the Barents Sea didn't fight at Stalingrad. The survivors who reached Arkhangelsk were, by all accounts, not in condition to reflect very clearly on the strategic dimensions of their situation. They were dealing with the immediate practical realities: medical care for the injured, food, dry clothing, communication with families, and the administrative processing that the machinery of war imposes on everyone who passes through it, regardless of what they've been through. The Soviet medical facilities were strained, but functional. Soviet civilians brought food to the docks. Descriptions of this in multiple accounts. Women with bread and milk appearing at the gangways of ships that had just arrived is one of those small human details that the official records don't capture, and the personal accounts consistently do. The city that had itself been bombed, whose people had their own losses and their own shortages, found things to share with the men coming off the ships. That detail doesn't resolve anything about the scatter order or the command decisions or the strategic consequences. It simply happened, and it's in the record, and it belongs here. Dowding's conduct in the weeks following his arrival at Arkhangelsk has received less attention than his departure from Hvalfjörður or his rescue from the Barents Sea, and I think that's an omission worth correcting. He didn't stop working when he docked. He transferred to the Soviet icebreaker Merman and went back out, back into the waters around Novaya Zemlya, looking for stragglers, collecting surviving ships from the anchorages where they'd sheltered, trying to bring the last of his convoy in. He found the CAM ship Empire Tide, still carrying her catapult Hurricane fighter, crammed with survivors from other ships, unable to maneuver properly. He found the Winston-Salem hard aground in a bay. He found people he hadn't known were still alive. The last group reached Arkhangelsk on the 24th of July. A Soviet tug refloated Winston-Salem 4 days later and dragged her in. Dowding's convoy report had said 3 ships. 11 made it in the end. He went back out and found 8 more. That's not in most accounts of PQ-17. It should be. The material record of what Arkhangelsk received from PQ-17 was inventoried and filed by Soviet port authorities, cross-referenced with the Lend-Lease protocols, and transmitted in summary form to the British mission in Moscow. The Soviet government's official response to the disaster was measured and diplomatic in tone, while privately furious. Stalin's communications to Churchill in the weeks following PQ-17 expressed, with varying degrees of directness, the view that the Western Allies had failed to deliver on their commitments, and that the suspension of convoys following the disaster was unacceptable. Churchill's reply, attempting to explain the naval realities of the Arctic and summer, produced one of the more tense exchanges in the entire wartime correspondence between the two leaders. The material consequences of PQ-17 were felt in those letters. The word convoy had become, in Allied diplomacy, a loaded term with specific weight attached to it, and that weight was measured in tanks and aircraft that were sitting on the floor of the Barents Sea instead of on the Eastern Front. The 11th of July in Arkhangelsk harbor at midday. Dowding was on the dock. His convoy report was being typed up. The 11 ships that would eventually be counted as survivors of PQ-17 were scattered between the port, the White Sea approaches, and the anchorages around Novaya Zemlya that the last stragglers hadn't yet left. In the cargo manifests and the casualty lists and the diplomatic cables, the operation was being counted and assessed and argued over. On the docks, the unloading was already beginning. The 3-ton crane lifts, one at a time, working through what remained. A crated Hurricane fighter, wings detached, being lowered onto a Soviet flat car. A Valentine tank turret, on its own, being moved to a reassembly point. The material that had survived the Barents Sea, passing through the hands of Soviet dockworkers in a bombed port city, beginning its journey toward a front that was hundreds of kilometers away and moving. The accounting was far from finished. Chapter 14. The Weight of the Signal Log. July 1942. The Admiralty, London. Somewhere in the files of the Plans and Operations Division, a signals log was being studied with the kind of attention that official documents receive only when something has gone catastrophically wrong. The three signals of the 4th of July, the cruiser withdrawal at 21:11, the disperse order at 21:23, the scatter order at 21:36, were now being examined not as operational communications, but as evidence. Admiral Tovey had filed his formal complaint within days of the disaster. The complaint was direct and unambiguous in a way that formal naval correspondence rarely permits itself to be. He placed responsibility for the destruction of the convoy squarely on the Admiralty for the scattering of the convoy. A serving fleet admiral, during active wartime, formally accusing his own institutional superiors of causing the single largest Allied convoy loss of the war. The complaint was received. It was processed. It produced, ultimately, no formal finding of individual culpability. The three signals, read in sequence, tell a story that the available documentary record partially illuminates and partially obscures. The first signal, withdrawing the cruiser force, was justified by U-boat intelligence, a fact that the Admiralty did not share with Hamilton when it sent the order. Hamilton received an instruction to withdraw at high speed and was not told the actual reason. He inferred from the instruction that the surface threat was imminent, which was the wrong inference, drawn from incomplete information, with consequences that Hamilton had no means to avoid because the relevant context had been withheld from him. The second signal, dispersing the convoy, arrived 12 minutes later and compounded the inference. The third signal, scattering, arrived 13 minutes after the second, using a word that in Royal Navy doctrine carried a specific operational meaning. The enemy is already here. No new intelligence had arrived at the Admiralty between the second and third signals. The escalation from disperse to scatter came from inside the room, not from outside it. Tovey's specific accusation in his formal complaint goes beyond the scatter order itself, and this is the aspect of his document that has been most consistently underplayed in subsequent accounts. He wasn't simply arguing that the scatter order was wrong. He was arguing that the Admiralty had violated the fundamental principle of naval command by issuing a tactical order from London over the heads of the officers at sea. In the Royal Navy's established doctrine, the Admiralty set strategic objectives and operational parameters. The admiral at sea, the officer with direct observation of the tactical situation, made tactical decisions within those parameters. When Pound sent the scatter order directly to the convoy, bypassing both Broome and Hamilton and without consulting Tovey, he was substituting his distant, incomplete, and intelligence-starved assessment for the direct observation of men who were there. Broome, who had just watched his convoy beat off a major torpedo attack, had assessed the situation as manageable. Pound, who had a map in London and a question about where Tirpitz was, had assessed it as catastrophic. Pound's assessment overrode Broome's because Pound outranked Broome. It had no other claim to precedence. The American reaction to PQ-17 has received less attention in British accounts of the disaster than it deserves, partly because it was expressed in diplomatic and inter-service channels rather than in public, and partly because acknowledging it clearly would require acknowledging the degree to which the disaster damaged the Anglo-American naval partnership at its most sensitive early stage. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the United States Navy, was not a man who suppressed his views through excessive diplomacy. His communications to the combined chiefs of staff in the weeks following the disaster described the PQ-17 operation in terms that the available summaries characterize as expressing serious concerns about British naval competence in the handling of joint operations. The fact that American warships, USS Wichita, USS Tuscaloosa, and their destroyer screens had been withdrawn from protecting a convoy in which 23 of the 35 merchant ships were American flagged, and that those 23 ships had then been largely destroyed, was not a situation that King was prepared to process quietly. His relationship with Pound had been complex before PQ-17. It did not improve afterward. Churchill's assessment of the scatter order, written in his post-war memoir, The Second World War, is a carefully constructed piece of retrospective evaluation that manages to be simultaneously honest and protective. He acknowledges that the decision was made on negative evidence, the absence of confirmation that Tirpitz was still in port, treated as evidence that she was at sea. He suggests that the knowledge that American as well as British warships were involved may have influenced Pound's thinking. The political weight of the first joint Anglo-American naval operation under British command potentially adding a factor to the calculation that pure naval logic wouldn't have included. He stopped short of explicit condemnation. One cannot be certain that a different choice would have been wiser, he writes, while also acknowledging that the knowledge that it was wrong makes it more painful. That double formulation, it might have been right, but we know it was wrong, is about as close as Churchill ever came to criticizing a decision made by one of his own senior officers in a wartime publication. It's not nothing. It's also not Tovey's directness. When I work through the Admiralty's internal post-action assessment, the inquiry that followed the disaster and that produced no formal findings of individual responsibility, what strikes me most is not what it concluded, but what it declined to address. The inquiry examined the signals record, the intelligence picture, the command decisions. It found the scatter order to have been precipitate, a word carefully chosen to mean premature without meaning wrong. It did not address the question of whether Pound's decision-making process had been adequate. It did not address the intelligence failure at Bletchley Park that had deprived Pound of ultra coverage at the critical moment. It did not address the command architecture violation that Tovey had specifically identified. It produced, in essence, a finding that something had gone wrong without specifying what it was or who was responsible for it. Pound remained First Sea Lord. He died of his brain tumor in October of 1943. He was given a state funeral. The inquiry's findings were filed. The question of what happened in the operations room on the evening of the 4th of July and why was left for subsequent historians to argue about. The specific technical violation in the scatter order that Tovey's complaint identifies, that it used the words scatter rather than disperse, with all the doctrinal implications of that choice, is not simply a matter of word selection. In the Royal Navy's Convoy tactical doctrine, scatter was a specific operational instruction with a specific meaning. Disperse immediately and at maximum speed in all directions, abandoning formation discipline entirely, on the assumption that an enemy surface force is already in contact range. Disperse was a different instruction. Proceed independently toward port, maintaining general directional coherence at best speed. The choice between these words was not stylistic. It was the difference between telling the merchant ships that Tirpitz was possibly coming and telling them that Tirpitz was already there. Pound had sent a disperse order at 21:23. 13 minutes later, he upgraded it to scatter. Nothing changed in the intelligence picture during those 13 minutes. He simply decided that his own previous signal hadn't been urgent enough, and he expressed that urgency by choosing the more alarming word. The men aboard those ships read the word correctly and understood it as the doctrine intended them to understand it. They assumed the enemy was present. The escorts assumed the same. The escorts left at full speed. Tirpitz was in Altenfjord. The post-war accounts of the officers who were present in the Admiralty's operations room on the evening of the 4th of July are fragmentary, and in some cases contradictory in ways that are themselves informative. Several accounts describe Pound as making the final decision essentially alone, asking Denning the key question about Tirpitz's location, receiving the answer that certainty couldn't be guaranteed, and then proceeding without further consultation. Other accounts suggest a more collegial process, with various officers contributing assessments that Pound then weighed. The contradiction between these accounts may reflect the difference between what actually happened and what participants subsequently preferred to have happened. In my reading of the available material, the weight of evidence leans toward the more isolated account, toward a First Sea Lord who, under extreme time pressure, made a unilateral decision based on an inference from incomplete intelligence without adequately consulting the commanders at sea or his own intelligence staff. Whether that decision-making style was characteristic of Pound's entire tenure, or was a specific product of the evening's pressures and his medical condition, is a question that the available archive raises but cannot answer. The immediate consequence of the Admiralty's failure to assign individual responsibility was that the command architecture that had produced the disaster was not fundamentally reformed before the next convoy sailed. PQ-18 departed on the 2nd of September, 1942, less than 2 months after PQ-17's destruction. It carried an escort carrier, HMS Avenger, which represented a genuine improvement in the convoy's air defense capability. 13 ships of Q-18 were sunk, compared to 24 of Q-17's. The improvement was real, but painful. The Admiralty's response to the Q-17 disaster had been to add an escort carrier, not to address the command architecture question that Tovey had identified. The scatter order was not sent again. But the conditions that had produced it, a First Sea Lord who could override the tactical commander at sea from London without adequate intelligence, under political pressure, possibly under the influence of progressive neurological disease, those conditions were not structurally changed. They were managed by the fact that Pound died and was replaced. The signal log closes with 21:36 on the 4th of July. What follows in the official record is the administrative processing of a disaster. The casualty notifications, the inquiry papers, the diplomatic correspondence, the revised convoy planning documents, the post-action assessments from the escort commanders. Tovey's complaint is in the file. The Admiralty's response is in the file. The inquiry findings are in the file. All of it, filed, archived, classified for varying periods, and eventually available to researchers who can read the documents and try to understand what happened in that room on that evening between a dying admiral and a question he couldn't answer. The signal log is precise about the times. 21:11, 21:23, 21:36. The intervals are exact. What happened in the minutes between them, what was said, what was considered, what was dismissed, is in the silence between the entries. Chapter 15. Operation Knight's Move. The German Record. Banak Airfield, Northern Norway, the 11th of July, 1942. The operations room of Luftflotte 5 was compiling its after-action summary for the engagement against Convoy PQ-17. The clerks were working through pilot debriefs, comparing claims against known sinkings, cross-referencing with the U-boat command's own tally, trying to produce a number that would satisfy Reichsmarschall Göring's headquarters in Berlin. The process of claims adjudication in the German air forces was a known institutional problem. Pilots under combat stress reported what they saw or thought they saw, and what they saw or thought they saw was frequently an already sinking ship being attributed to their own torpedo when it had been hit first by a U-boat, or a near miss being recorded as a hit in the confusion of smoke and spray and the rush of an evasive break from anti-aircraft fire. The PQ-17 operation was more complicated than most to adjudicate because the aircraft and the submarines had been working simultaneously against the same scattered ships, and both services wanted credit for the results. The final German air claim for the PQ-17 operation was 202 dive and torpedo bomber sorties, resulting in the destruction of a significant number of merchant vessels. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm claimed that its 11 submarines had fired approximately 72 torpedoes during the operation, of which 29 had scored hits and exploded, a hit rate of approximately 40%. 9 of the U-boats were credited with confirmed kills. Both services' numbers were subject to the institutional inflation that characterized German claims reporting throughout the war, and the inter-service rivalry over credit for the convoy's destruction was, by available accounts, vigorous. Göring awarded 3 Knight's Crosses to Luftwaffe aircrews specifically for their conduct in the operation, a gesture that the Kriegsmarine noticed and resented. The Navy's own assessment credited the U-boat arm with the larger share of confirmed sinkings. The rivalry was petty in the way that institutional rivalry is always petty, and it sat alongside a genuine military achievement that required no inflation to be impressive. What the German operational record shows, when you read it against the Allied record simultaneously, is the precise moment at which the character of the engagement changed. Before the scatter order, the German air attacks on the 4th of July had been conducted against a concentrated, defended convoy with a full escort screen and functioning collective anti-aircraft fire. In approximately 2 hours of attacks on the 4th, the Germans sank 2 merchant ships and lost 4 aircraft, an exchange rate that, while clearly in Germany's favor, was sustainable only with significant ongoing attrition. After the scatter order, the attacks on the 5th of July and subsequent days were conducted against individual, unescorted merchant ships spread across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The aircraft losses on those days were minimal. The German after-action assessment of Luftflotte 5 notes, with a precision that the Admiralty's own post-action documents lack, that the primary enabling condition for the operation's success was the enemy's decision to scatter. The German official record says, in plain language, that the enemy helped them win. The Golden Comb tactic, Goldene Zange, that Luftflotte 5 had developed and refined for use against defended convoys, was, after the scatter order, essentially irrelevant. The Golden Comb involved coordinated waves of torpedo aircraft converging on a convoy from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing the anti-aircraft gunners to divide their fire and reducing the chance of any single attacker being engaged consistently through its approach. It required a concentrated target, a convoy in formation with overlapping fields of fire from multiple vessels' weapons. Against individual scattered ships, the tactic was unnecessary. A single aircraft could approach a lone merchant vessel from any angle without encountering more than that vessel's own defensive armament, which was minimal. The tactical sophistication that the Germans had invested months developing for fighting a defended convoy was rendered superfluous by a 25-word signal from London. The grounding of Lützow and the 3 destroyers on uncharted rocks during the surface fleet's initial sortie attempt on the 3rd of July is a detail that the German operational record handles with some delicacy. The official account describes navigational difficulties in poorly charted waters. The post-war accounts of surviving crew members are less euphemistic. The charts used by the German destroyer force for the fjord approaches in that area were, by several accounts, inadequate for the specific conditions of the passage, and the speed at which the force was moving, the urgency of getting to sea before the tactical window closed, meant that the caution appropriate for poorly charted waters was not observed. Lützow, running aground in Chelsen, sustained damage severe enough to put her out of the operation entirely. 3 destroyers required varying degrees of repair. 1/4 of the surface strike force was removed from the operation before it reached open water, by the rocks of its own coast. This is not mentioned in the Knight's Crosses ceremony. The U-boat arms contribution to the PQ-17 operation is best understood through a single statistical fact that I want to be precise about. Not one Allied weapon, gun, depth charge, torpedo, bomb, damaged a German submarine during the entire engagement. Not one. 3 U-boats sustained damage during the operation, but all 3 were damaged by German aircraft. Friendly fire incidents in which Luftwaffe aircraft, attacking what they assessed as targets in the water, hit submarines that were operating in the area. The Allied anti-submarine capability that had been a genuine deterrent when the convoy was concentrated and the escorts were in position simply ceased to function when the escorts withdrew. The minesweepers and corvettes that remained in the area after the scatter were too small, too slow, and too isolated to mount effective anti-submarine operations against submarines that were operating with complete tactical freedom. The Type 7 U-boats worked the scattered convoy with something approaching impunity, prosecuting multiple attacks in a single day, surfacing between engagements to recharge batteries, communicating freely with each other and with command. They had trained for years for this kind of operation. They had never had it this easy. I want to spend a moment with the Paulus Potter documents, because they represent a specific German intelligence gain from the operation that has received almost no attention in English-language accounts. When U-255 found the abandoned Dutch freighter on the 13th of July, still afloat as a derelict, and German sailors boarded her, They found in the chart room and the captain's cabin the ship's sailing orders, signal code books for Arctic convoy operations, and other operational documentation. The crew had abandoned the ship too rapidly, under air attack, to destroy the classified materials. The German intelligence harvest from the Paulus Potter was significant enough to affect the planning of subsequent convoy operations. The codes obtained were assessed as current and actionable. A merchant crew abandoning a sinking ship under bombing is not, by any reasonable standard, culpable for failing to destroy documents before leaving. The point is simply that the scatter order, by creating the conditions for rapid, disorganized abandonment of ships, produced this secondary intelligence failure along with everything else. The German strategic assessment of the PQ-17 operation in the weeks following its conclusion was, by the available records, satisfied but not triumphalist. The Naval Staff's analysis noted the success, but also noted its enabling conditions honestly. The surface fleet had not engaged. The tactical success had been achieved primarily by air and submarine forces, and the Allied response, suspension of convoys for 2 months, introduction of escort carriers for subsequent operations, suggested that the advantage gained was temporary. When PQ-18 sailed in September of 1942 with the escort carrier HMS Avenger, the German air losses were sharply higher. 41 aircraft destroyed against 13 merchant ships sunk, compared to 5 aircraft against 24 ships for PQ-17. The lesson that the Admiralty had drawn from the disaster, provide adequate air cover, was the correct lesson, applied 2 months later than it could have been. The German tactical assessment for PQ-18 noted the changed exchange rate with concern. The edge that the scatter order had given them had been removed. The Knight's Crosses, awarded by Goering to 3 Luftwaffe aircrew following PQ-17, were presented at a ceremony in Berlin, at which the specific contributions of the recipients were described in terms that emphasized the courage and skill of the air attacks. The Kriegsmarine officers present at the ceremony, by the account of at least one participant, regarded the framing as a selective presentation of what had actually occurred. The merchant ships of PQ-17 had been, after the scatter order, essentially defenseless targets. The courage involved in attacking them was real. Anti-aircraft fire from individual ships was genuinely dangerous, and low-level torpedo approaches were always hazardous, regardless of defensive capability. But the tactical conditions after the 4th of July had reduced the engagement from a contested air battle to something closer to target practice against isolated opponents. The awards were given, the ceremony was held. The record noted that 5 German aircraft had been lost in 202 sorties. The mathematics of the operation were in the ceremony room, whether anyone chose to acknowledge them or not. The last entry in the Luftflotte 5 operations log for the PQ-17 engagement is dated the 10th of July, 1942, and records the final attacks on the group of ships making their way from the Novaya Zemlya anchorage toward the White Sea. The attack in which the Hoosier and the El Capitan were damaged and abandoned, and in which the rescue ship Zamalek was lifted from the water by a bomb's pressure wave and somehow survived. After that entry, the log moves on to other operations, other tasking, other convoys. PQ-17 becomes a historical entry rather than an active operation. The clerks at Banach had their final numbers. The U-boat command had its final count. The German surface fleet had returned to Altenfjord and resumed its waiting. The operation was over. The accounting was complete. 5 aircraft and 30 irreplaceable fuel oil had produced 24 ships and 153 men. The German record closed the file. Chapter 16. The Trial of Memory. London, the High Court. The year 1970. 28 years had passed since the 4th of July, 1942, and a retired British admiral was in a witness box defending his conduct during 25 minutes of naval history. Jack Broom was 65 years old. He was there because David Irving, a British historian whose book on PQ-17 had been published in 1968, had characterized his departure from the convoy in terms that Broom found professionally defamatory implying that he had voluntarily abandoned the merchant ships beyond the strict requirement of the scatter order, that the decision to join Hamilton's cruiser force was, to some degree, a choice made with more latitude than his orders required. Broome had sued for libel. The case had proceeded through the English courts for 2 years and was now at trial. The witnesses were men in their 60s and 70s who were being asked to reconstruct, under cross-examination, the events of a specific 25-minute period nearly 3 decades earlier. The primary documents were the same signals that had been in the Admiralty's files since July of 1942. The legal standard for defamation in English courts required Broome's team to establish 3 things: that the published statements were defamatory in their ordinary meaning, that they were factually false, and that they referred to an identifiable individual in a way that damaged his reputation. The core factual dispute was the question of what the scatter order actually required, and whether Broome had done more than it required, or merely exactly what it required. Irving's position was that Broome had interpreted the order expansively, that he had taken his destroyers to join Hamilton's cruisers rather than, for example, remaining in the general area of the convoy even at reduced speed while the merchant ships scattered. Broome's position was that the order was unambiguous, that his professional training had given him a specific and correct understanding of what scatter meant in naval doctrine, and that he had followed the order as it was intended to be followed. The court's task was, in essence, to determine whether a retired admiral's interpretation of a naval signal 30 years after the event was libelously characterized by a historian. The trial produced, as its most significant historical contribution, a body of testimony that no official inquiry had ever generated. The witnesses were cross-examined, documents were challenged, the Royal Navy's tactical doctrine on the meaning of scatter versus disperse was explained to a civil court by expert witnesses. Hamilton's actions were examined against the orders he had received. Broome's decision to have his destroyers join the cruiser force rather than the smaller escort vessels was scrutinized. The question of what Pound had known and when was addressed, insofar as the available documents allowed. None of this had been done in any official proceeding. The inquiry of 1942 had produced no formal findings of individual responsibility. The legal proceedings of 1970 produced, under adversarial conditions with the standard of evidence a court requires, a tested record of what the available documents actually showed. Broome won the case. The court found that Irving's characterization of his conduct was defamatory and factually unsupported by the evidence. Irving was ordered to pay damages. The verdict was, in legal terms, a finding that the specific statements made about Broome were false and damaging. It was not, in the strict historical sense, a finding about whether the scatter order was right or wrong, or whether the Admiralty bore responsibility for the disaster. Courts determine liability. They don't determine historical truth. But the verdict did establish, under the evidentiary standards of the English legal system, that Broome had followed his orders and that his professional characterization of those orders was accurate. He had left because he was told to leave. The word scatter meant what he said it meant. He had read the signal correctly. What I find most useful about the Broome versus Irving proceedings as a historical source is not the verdict, but the secondary archive it generated. The trial record contains testimony from surviving participants, documentary analysis, expert assessment of naval doctrine, and cross-examination of claims that had previously circulated only in published histories without challenge. Broome's own witness statement, in which he describes the moment of his signal exchange with Dowding and the circumstances of the escort's departure from the convoy, is the most thoroughly tested account of those events in existence. It was given under oath, challenged by opposing counsel, and assessed by a court. Its status as evidence is categorically different from the status of the same account in a memoir, where it is also sincere but unchallenged. The trial record is, paradoxically, a more reliable primary source for the specific events of the 4th of July than most of the documents that historians have traditionally cited for the same period. The connection between the Broome versus Irving case and the subsequent development of David Irving's historical work is something that most accounts of PQ-17 either don't mention or treat as entirely separate. I don't think it's entirely separate. The libel damages and legal costs that Irving incurred as a result of the case were significant enough to affect his financial position and his professional standing in ways that subsequent biographers have documented. His subsequent embrace of Holocaust denial positions in the 1970s and 80s, positions that led to a far more consequential libel case in 2000, which he initiated and lost, placed him in a category of historical disrepute that made the PQ-17 controversy look minor. But the sequence matters. A British historian, whose interpretation of a convoy disaster was found defamatory in 1970, subsequently developing views about the Second World War that were found to be deliberately falsified in 2000. The Broom versus Irving case sits at the beginning of that arc. It isn't unconnected to what came after. The question that the trial raised but couldn't answer, because courts answer questions about liability, not questions about causation, was the question that Broom himself had been asking since the 5th of July, 1942. If he had followed his orders correctly, and Hamilton had followed his orders correctly, and the escorts had done exactly what they were supposed to do, and the convoy had been destroyed anyway, then who was responsible? The answer that the trial's logic implied was Pound. But Pound had died in October of 1943. You cannot sue a dead man for libel. You cannot cross-examine a brain tumor. The question of Pound's culpability, which was the actual historical question underneath the legal proceedings, was not resolved by the verdict. Broom had been cleared. The responsibility, having nowhere left to go, remained in the space where Pound used to be. The handwritten log from HMS Keppel that Broom submitted in evidence during the trial, his own real-time record of the events of the 4th of July, written while the events were occurring or immediately after them, has not been published in full in any subsequent history of PQ-17. It exists in the trial record. It is, in terms of the evidentiary hierarchy of primary sources, one of the most valuable documents in the entire archive, a contemporaneous written account by the officer most directly involved in the decision to withdraw, produced before retrospective narrative and institutional self-protection had time to shape the record. The trial ended. The parties went home. The log went back into the file. The Admiralty's inquiry had produced no findings. The court had found Broom not liable. The signal log from the 4th of July still read 2111, 2123, 2136. Nothing in either proceeding had changed what those times meant. The afternoon of the verdict, and London was going about its business as London does. The legal proceedings were reported in the press, noted in the relevant professional communities, and filed away. Broom had his vindication. Irving had his damages bill. The PQ-17 record had its most thoroughly tested set of testimonies, and in the Admiralty's archives, somewhere in the ADM series, the original signals were still exactly as they had been filed in July of 1942. 3 messages, 25 minutes, a decision that no subsequent legal proceeding had managed quite to fully explain. Chapter 17. The Arctic Star and the Open Question. The summer of 2012, London. A government announcement, made quietly and without particular ceremony, confirmed that a new campaign medal would be created for veterans of the Arctic convoys of the Second World War, the Arctic Star. Eligibility would extend to those who had served north of the Arctic Circle in operational conditions between 1941 and 1945. The medal's citation, as eventually published, read, "For operational service in the Arctic." 5 words. No mention of specific convoys, no mention of PQ-17, no mention of the scatter order, the 24 ships, the 153 dead, or the 70-year campaign that had preceded the medal's creation. Official language tends toward compression when the history it is compressing is uncomfortable, and the Arctic Star's citation is, in that respect, a small masterpiece of institutional brevity. The campaign for formal recognition of Arctic convoy veterans had been running in various organized forms since at least the 1960s. The veterans had a name for themselves, members of the North Russia Club, among other associations, and they had been petitioning successive British governments for a dedicated campaign medal for decades. The arguments against it were bureaucratic. The existing medal framework covered Atlantic service and general naval service, and the creation of a specific Arctic star would open questions about other unrecognized campaigns and create precedents that the medal authorities were reluctant to set. The veterans' counter-argument was simple and remained consistent across 50 years of lobbying. The Arctic route had an 85-ship loss rate that was 17 times higher than the Atlantic campaign rate. The men who sailed it had experienced something categorically different from standard convoy service. The absence of specific recognition was not an administrative oversight. It was a choice. By the time the Arctic Star was approved in 2012, the veteran community for whom it had been sought was a fraction of what it had been at the campaign's beginning. The convoy operations had ended in 1945. The youngest men who had served on them were in their mid-80s. Estimates vary, but the number of surviving Arctic convoy veterans alive in 2012 to receive the medal was somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 4,000, a small fraction of the approximately 66,000 who had served on the route over 4 years. The ceremony at which the medal was formally announced was attended by veterans in their 80s and 90s, some in wheelchairs, some unable to travel and represented by family members. One veteran's recorded comment, cited in several accounts of the ceremony, described it as recognition about 40 years too late to matter to most of the people who deserved it. The arithmetic was not wrong. The majority of the men who should have received the medal had died waiting for it. The question of why it took 70 years requires an honest answer, and the honest answer has more than one component. The administrative argument, that creating a specific Arctic star would disturb the existing medal framework, was real but not decisive. Governments find ways to create new medals when there is sufficient political will to do so. The more substantial reason, which is acknowledged in the post-approval commentary of several people involved in the campaign, was that a dedicated Arctic convoy medal would inevitably draw public and parliamentary attention to PQ-17. A medal for Arctic convoy service was, implicitly, a medal for surviving or dying in a disaster that was caused by a command decision made in London. The political discomfort of that connection, of formally commemorating an event whose central narrative involved an admiralty order that destroyed 2/3 of its convoy, was never the publicly stated reason for the delay, but it was present in the political calculations that produced it. The Arctic Star's citations 5 words, for operational service in the Arctic, are a document of what that discomfort looked like when it was finally resolved. The 3 questions that remain formally unanswered in the PQ-17 historical record are worth stating precisely, because precision about what we don't know is as important as precision about what we do. The first question is whether Dudley Pound's brain tumor affected his cognitive capacity on the evening of the 4th of July, 1942. The medical evidence available, postmortem findings, contemporary observations by colleagues of cognitive rigidity and episodes of apparent absence, is suggestive but not conclusive. The tumor was present. Its effects on specific decision-making at specific moments cannot be established from the available record. The second question is, what intelligence, or intelligence vacuum, actually convinced Pound that Tirpitz was at sea or imminently likely to be? The signals record shows no new intelligence arriving between the second and third signals on the 4th of July. The intelligence picture had not worsened. The decision to upgrade from disperse to scatter was made without external prompting. What internal reasoning produced that upgrade cannot be recovered from the archive. The third question is whether a different decision would have produced a different outcome, whether PQ-17, kept together with its escorts, could have fought its way through. The July 4th air battle suggests the answer is possibly yes. The weight of German resources deployed against the convoy suggests the answer might eventually have been no regardless. The question remains open because the convoy was scattered before it could demonstrate the answer. The historiographical debate between the scholars who have studied PQ-17 most closely has never fully resolved around a single verdict on Pound's decision. The argument in Pound's favor, and it is not without substance, runs like this. At the moment he issued the scatter order, he could not confirm that Tirpitz was still in port. If she was at sea, concentrated convoy formation was tactically suicidal. 45,000 tons of battleship against a convoy of cargo vessels would have produced a different kind of massacre than the one that actually occurred, but a massacre nonetheless. Under genuine uncertainty, and with the understanding that the cost of being wrong about Tirpitz's location in one direction was lower than the cost of being wrong in the other direction, the scatter order was a rational response to an unresolvable intelligence problem. The argument against Pound runs, the intelligence, in the hands of a commander willing to trust his analysts and consult his officers at sea, did not support the conclusion that Tirpitz was at sea. Denning believed she was in port. Broome had just watched his convoy beat off a major air attack. Tovey had not been consulted. The scatter order was a unilateral decision made in an information vacuum that Pound had, in part, created by failing to use the consultation mechanisms available to him. Both arguments are supported by the documents. The documents do not resolve the dispute between them. The Oral History Archive at the Arctic Convoy Museum at Altby in Scotland opened in 2013 and holding recorded testimony from more than 200 veterans, contains within it an account that I've thought about frequently in the course of this work. A merchant seaman who sailed on PQ-17 and survived, interviewed in 2014, a man in his 90s, was asked what he wanted people to understand about the convoy. His answer, as recorded, was not about Admiral Pound or the scatter order or the command decisions or the diplomatic consequences or any of the strategic dimensions that historians spend their time on. He said, "We just wanted someone to say we were there, that we did something, that it counted." He died in 2016. His name is in the memorial register at the museum. That answer, so specific and so unresolved at the same time, opens into a question that outlasts the immediate history of PQ-17. What does a society owe the men who sailed those ships? The naval personnel had the structures of military service to provide some framework: rank, medals, next of kin notifications, pension rights, the formal acknowledgement of sacrifice that military institutions exist partly to provide. The merchant mariners occupied a different category. Civilian employees who had been in every practical sense at war, who had faced the same weapons and the same water temperature and the same German aircraft, who had died in the same numbers and in the same ocean, and who had for decades been processed through the civilian rather than the military apparatus for recognition and benefit. The gap between those two categories of recognition, closed only partially and very late, is one of the more uncomfortable legacies of the entire Arctic convoy operation, not specific to PQ-17, but most visible there, where the losses were greatest and the cause of those losses was the most clearly avoidable. The convoy that sailed from Hvalfjörður on the 27th of June 1942 under a sky that never quite went dark, carrying 210 Hurricanes and 430 tanks, and the handwritten margin note of a Philadelphia clerk who had written, "God willing," on a loading manifest, that convoy's story doesn't end cleanly. It doesn't end with a verdict, or a medal ceremony, or a legal judgment, or a historian's conclusion. It ends with 11 ships in Arkhangelsk and 24 on the floor of the Barents Sea, and a retired admiral in a witness box in London in 1970, still trying to explain what the word scatter meant and why he had left. It ends with a veteran in his 90s in 2014 saying he wanted someone to say it counted. It ends with the signal log, 2111, 2123, 2136. Times that don't change. An order that can't be unissued. The 4th of July, 1942. 21:36 hours. The scatter order transmitted, received, acted upon. The merchant ships turning on to their individual headings in the pale Arctic evening. The warships accelerating west. The BV-138 still circling overhead, its engines audible from the bridge of every ship in what had been a convoy and was now a scatter of isolated vessels across the Barents Sea. Somewhere in the water below the circling aircraft, the surviving logs and correspondence and signals and after-action reports that would eventually constitute the historical record were still weeks from being written. The men who would write them were still at sea. The history of PQ-17 was still in the process of happening. Tirpitz was in Altenfjord. The signal had been sent. The damage was done. The clerk's marginal note on the Philadelphia Manifest had said, "God willing." The ships had sailed, willing or not. The loading manifest went into a file. The file went into an archive. The archive still exists. The note is still in the margin. The handwriting is still different from the rest of the document. Someone added it after the fact. Someone who already knew how the story ended, or suspected, or simply felt, in the moment of signing off on a cargo of cordite and tanks and aircraft bound for a port on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, that the appropriate response was not a signature, but a prayer. Whether it was answered depends, as most such questions do, on which of the 35 ships you happened to be on when the answer came.